Hi there. Tonight we journey back through the mists of time, stepping into the dusty, soften, unforgiving shoes of women across various ancient civilizations. Imagine yourself transported to a bustling marketplace in ancient Babylon, the scent of spices and sweat thick in the air, the distant murmur of voices a constant hum. You're just going about your day, perhaps haggling for a clay pot or a handful of dates, utterly unaware of the invisible threads of law and custom that dictated so much of your existence. And if those threads snapped, particularly regarding something as fundamental as marital fidelity, well, you probably wouldn't survive the day with your reputation, or even your life, intact. It was a world where whispers could become chains, and accusations could become fatal. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Feel free to drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see how far these sleepy historical tales travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our adventure begins in the very cradle of civilization, ancient Mesopotamia, where the first comprehensive written laws emerged, etched onto imposing stone steles and clay tablets. You're standing in front of one such monument, perhaps the formidable Code of Hammurabi, dating back to roughly 1754 BC, the cuneiform script, a series of intricate wedge-shaped marks, seems to pulse with ancient authority in the flickering torchlight. As you lean in closer, a particularly stern section catches your eye. This isn't just about civil disputes. This is about life and death, particularly for women. Here, a woman accused of adultery faced a truly harrowing ordeal. Picture the scene. She's brought before a local assembly, perhaps even before priests at a temple, acting as judges. Article 129 of Hammurabi's Code, an unyielding decree, declares, if a man's wife, because of another man, has been caught in lying with a male, they shall bind them and throw them into the water. Yes, that's precisely what it says. Both the accused woman and her alleged lover were bound together and cast into the river. This wasn't merely a harsh punishment. It was a form of trial by ordeal, specifically the river ordeal. The prevailing belief was that the gods, particularly the river god, would intervene. If the accused was innocent, the divine current would allow her to float. If guilty, she would sink and drown. The stark reality, of course, was that floating often meant immediate declaration of guilt, leading to execution, while sinking certainly meant death. A truly no-win scenario, wouldn't you agree? It certainly puts modern relationship counseling into perspective. Now, a very valid question arises. What about the man? And indeed, the laws were often far from symmetrical. While Hammurabi's code did include provisions for men and their transgressions, the penalties for female infidelity often carried a swifter, more public, and frequently lethal consequence. The concept of female chastity was inextricably linked to the honor of the family and, crucially, to the legitimacy of heirs. A woman's perceived purity was paramount, almost a communal asset, ensuring the clear lineage of property and power. A man's dalliances, while perhaps frowned upon, generally did not threaten the patrilineal line in the same foundational way. It's a bit like how a small crack in your living room wall might be unsightly, but a fundamental crack in the very foundation of your house is a far more existential threat. The actual enforcement of these severe written laws remains a subject of considerable academic discussion. While the code was clear, whether every accused woman truly faced the Euphrates' cold embrace is less certain. Local customs, the specific social standing of the individuals involved, and the willingness of accusers to press charges likely played a significant role. Perhaps, in some instances, a quiet family agreement or a substantial payment could avert the ultimate watery judgment. But the threat of such a horrifying fate was undeniably present, a chilling undercurrent beneath the daily hustle and bustle of Mesopotamian life. So, as you slowly turn away from that ancient, stern tablet, you might feel a profound sense of relief that your own marital disputes are unlikely to involve a forced swim test. Unless, of course, you've recently purchased a property with a surprisingly deep, ancient river in the backyard. Leaving the dusty plains and rigid laws of Mesopotamia, you now gently float westward, carried by the subtle currents of time along the majestic Nile. Arriving in the vibrant lands of ancient Egypt, here the sun is just as potent, casting long shadows across the fertile fields, but the legal landscape feels surprisingly different, almost refreshing. You're wandering through a bustling market, perhaps in Thebes, where the rich scent of freshly baked bread mingles with the delicate perfume of lotus blossoms. Women, both free and enslaved, move with a certain confident grace and agency, a marked contrast to the more constrained existence we observed in Babylon. And when it comes to the intricate world of marriage and its potential breaches, Egypt, in many respects, was remarkably progressive for its era. Unlike many other ancient societies we'll encounter, ancient Egyptian women commanded an impressive degree of legal and economic independence. Imagine this: a woman in ancient Egypt could not only own property in her own right, but she could also inherit land, manage her own business affairs, and even initiate legal proceedings in a court of law. It's almost unheard of for the time. Picture a woman, perhaps dressed in fine linen, confidently walking into court, presenting her case, even arguing against her own husband. Such a scenario wasn't just a fantasy, it was a documented reality. This relative equality extended, quite remarkably, to marital agreements. You see, Egyptian marriages weren't typically solemnized with grand, elaborate religious ceremonies. Instead, they were primarily civil contracts, meticulous agreements, often drawn up by professional scribes. These contracts, inscribed on precious papyrus scrolls, laid out the terms of the union, including explicit provisions for what would happen if the marriage were to dissolve for any reason. Now, when the sensitive issue of infidelity arose, the Egyptian approach leaned less towards public execution or brutal corporal punishment and more towards detailed financial and economic repercussions. Imagine a husband discovering his wife's unfaithfulness. He likely wouldn't immediately grab a large rock or search for the nearest convenient river. Instead, his first inclination might be to consult one of those scribes, meticulously reviewing the marital contract he'd signed. Often, if a wife was found to be in violation of her marital vows, she could face severe financial penalties. This might include losing her right to a pre-agreed dowry or forfeiting certain assets brought into the marriage. Conversely, and here's where the true balance emerges, if her husband was the unfaithful party, he too could face significant financial consequences. He might be compelled to pay a substantial sum to his wronged wife or lose certain rights to communal property. It functioned almost like an ancient prenuptial agreement, but with far more dramatic and sometimes life-altering stakes, where the precise definition of adultery carried the same profound moral weight across all social strata in Egypt. Or, if it was primarily a concern for the elite, where lineage and inheritance were absolutely paramount, is a point of ongoing academic discussion. For the common folk, perhaps a less formal, more community-driven resolution was often the norm. You might envision a wise village elder mediating a dispute, aiming to preserve the peace and ensure the local economy continued to function smoothly, rather than dragging everyone before a formal court with all its associated costs and complexities. Of course, this isn't to suggest that there were absolutely no severe consequences. In certain rare instances, particularly if the illicit affair involved a married man and a married woman, and especially if the honor of a powerful or noble family was directly at stake, outcomes could indeed be very grim. There are scattered hints in some ancient texts of private, extra-legal punishments, perhaps even culminating in death, carried out by the aggrieved family to restore their gravely wounded honor. But these seem to have been exceptional cases, deviations from the general rule enshrined within the formal Egyptian legal system. The prevailing wisdom within their legal framework seemed to be that marriage was a partnership, and breaches of that partnership primarily carried economic consequences that impacted both parties. You might even stumble upon a humorous papyrus fragment detailing a man's exasperated complaints about his wife's extravagant spending, as if that was the true marital crisis, rather than any romantic dalliances. It's almost refreshing in its focus on practical, financial matters, isn't it? As you slowly depart the sun-drenched banks of the Nile, you might find yourself quietly appreciating the ancient Egyptians' surprisingly pragmatic and balanced approach to marital woes, a system that, for its time, offered women a level of protection and agency rarely seen elsewhere. From the surprisingly equitable legal landscapes of Egypt, you're now whisked away through the annals of time to the rugged heart of ancient Anatolia, a land rich with copper mines, formidable mountains, and the sprawling might of the Hittite kingdom, flourishing roughly from 1600 to 1178 BC. Imagine colossal fortifications, intricate cuneiform tablets bearing diplomatic treaties, and the thunderous rumble of chariots echoing across vast plains. The Hittites, often considered a powerful but sometimes overlooked empire in the grand tapestry of ancient civilizations, possessed a legal code that was, in its own unique way, just as fascinating and undeniably peculiar as any we've encountered. Thus far, you find yourself observing a Hittite legal proceeding, perhaps within the bustling, fortified capital city of Hattusa. The crisp Anatolian air carries the scent of wood smoke from communal fires and the distant aroma of roasting meat. Unlike the divine river ordeals of Babylon or the detailed financial contracts of Egypt, Hittite law often leaned into a remarkably pragmatic, almost bureaucratic, approach to crime and punishment. Their meticulously recorded legal code, discovered on numerous clay tablets by archaeologists in the early 20th century, reveals a society that, for many offenses, prioritized compensation and a form of reconciliation over outright brutal retribution. This isn't to say it was gentle, but it had a distinct flavor of what's the practical solution here. When it came to the sensitive matter of infidelity, the Hittite laws present a truly curious and often unsettling case. Consider Article 197 of the Hittite laws, a terse yet potent declaration. If a man has intercourse with a woman, and her husband finds them and catches them, there is no penalty for him. This might initially strike you as vague, or perhaps even a license for violence on the part of the husband. However, it meticulously reflects a legal philosophy that drew a sharp distinction between a consensual act and a non-consensual one, and crucially, between catching the act and merely discovering it later. If the husband literally caught the two individuals in flagrante, delicto caught them in the very act the law essentially declared, well, the evidence is irrefutable, isn't it? What happens next is a private matter. This often meant the husband had the immediate legal right to kill both his unfaithful wife and her lover without any subsequent legal consequence from the state. It functions almost like an ancient justifiable homicide clause, but with far more dramatic, immediate, and utterly irreversible results. You definitely wouldn't want to be caught in that particular pickle, would you? It makes you appreciate the relative calm of modern traffic jams. However, the Hittite legal provisions become even more convoluted and, frankly, quite bizarre. If the husband did not catch them in the act, but merely suspected or discovered the infidelity afterward, the situation became far more nuanced and less immediately fatal. The law would then determine if the woman was forced into the act or if she acted willingly. If it was determined she was forced, the male perpetrator would be put to death, and the woman would be spared, often being returned to her husband's household. But if she was judged to have acted willingly, then both the woman and her lover were condemned to death. And here's where it gets truly unusual. There were even provisions for cases where the husband might hand over his wife to her lover. Yes, you heard that right. This highly unusual practice suggests a strong emphasis on the transfer of property rights, as a wife was, to some extent, considered part of her husband's transferable property. Imagine your own relationship issues being resolved by your partner, just passing you over to someone else. Here, she's yours now, and so is this ancient clay tablet detailing her value and the terms of transfer. It sounds like something pulled directly from a very strange, dark comedy, doesn't it? The frequency and true nature of these specific provisions, particularly the chilling handing over clause, remain a vibrant subject of academic inquiry. Some scholars propose it might have been a drastic but legally sanctioned method to avert escalating blood feuds between families, offering a formal legal pathway for resolution in cases of extreme marital breakdown. Other interpretations lean towards it being the ultimate form of disgrace for the woman, a complete and irreversible severing of her ties to her original family and her social standing. What is unequivocally clear, however, is that the Hittites, while not always as overtly punitive as some of their ancient neighbors, still centered their laws around the husband's rights and the rigorous maintenance of a patriarchal social order. So, as you slowly withdraw from the ancient Hittite kingdom, you might feel a lingering sense of bewilderment at their distinctive, bad, and at times quite chilling approach to the delicate balance of marital fidelity and family honor. From the stark, communal justice and unwavering religious strictures of ancient Israel, you are now gently swept westward, landing amidst the bustling, intellectually vibrant, and often fiercely independent Greek city-states of classical antiquity. Roughly spanning the 5th and 4th centuries BC, the very air here hums with the excited murmur of philosophical debate, the passionate rhetoric of politics, and the distinctive scent of olives and sea salt carried on a gentle breeze. Yet, beneath this veneer of democratic ideals and unparalleled artistic brilliance, a remarkably strict social order stubbornly persisted, particularly concerning the daily lives and roles of women. You will soon discover that while the ancient Greeks celebrated intellectual reason and idealized physical beauty, the concept of female autonomy, especially within the confines of marriage, was often tightly confined within surprisingly narrow, restrictive walls. Imagine yourself strolling leisurely through the agora in Athens, the vibrant, throbbing heart of public life. Here, free male citizens are engaged in earnest debate about the finer points of philosophy, the latest political maneuvers, and perhaps even the juiciest local gossip. Women, if they are seen out at all, are typically accompanied by a male guardian, or slave, and often modestly veiled, their public presence consciously limited and carefully controlled. Athenian society, despite its enduring reputation for pioneering democratic ideals, a privilege, it must be noted, strictly reserved for male citizens. It was surprisingly conservative and restrictive when it came to women's social roles and legal rights. A woman's primary, almost sacred purpose was to manage the household efficiently, produce legitimate male heirs to carry on the family name, and meticulously maintain the family's honor and reputation. And if that sacred honor was compromised by an act of infidelity, the consequences, especially for her lover, could be swift, brutal, and unequivocally severe. In Athens, a wronged husband whose wife was caught in the act of committing adultery had a potent, legally sanctioned right to kill the lover immediately and without fear of prosecution. This wasn't merely a right, it was almost an ingrained social expectation, a necessary and public act to restore his grievously damaged honor and the integrity of his lineage. The law, famously attributed to Draco, whose legal code was so notoriously harsh that it spawned the modern term draconian, essentially granted the aggrieved husband a full and unchallenged pass for justifiable homicide. You might find yourself wondering, with a slight shiver, if any Athenian husband ever, perhaps conveniently, caught a perceived rival in what was interpreted as the wrong place at the wrong time. It certainly makes you think twice about lingering too long at the local olive oil stand, doesn't it? As for the unfaithful wife herself, while she generally wouldn't be killed by her husband, though private retribution, carried out within the confines of the home, was always a terrifying risk, her fate was one of profound public shame and complete social ruin. She would be immediately and unceremoniously divorced, automatically losing her dowry and any semblance of social standing she once possessed. More than that, she might be legally forbidden from participating in public religious ceremonies, truly devastating blow in a deeply pious and ritualistic society, and could even be legally prevented from wearing certain types of expensive ornaments or from attending public places, effectively making her a social pariah. It was, in essence, a civic and social death, a complete stripping away of her identity, her dignity, and her respectability within the community. It's almost like being utterly and completely cancelled on a truly ancient, irrevocable scale, but without even the modern, fleeting option of attempting a new identity on a digital platform now. Let's starkly contrast this with Sparta Athens, formidable rival, a city-state renowned for its uncompromisingly militaristic and rigorously disciplined society, which consequently adopted a truly unique approach to gender roles. Spartan women generally enjoyed significantly more freedom and physical education than their Athenian counterparts. They trained rigorously, managed vast estates while their husbands were away on extended military campaigns, and even had a more direct, albeit still limited, say in the arrangement of their marriages. You might logically assume, given this greater freedom, that infidelity would be treated with a surprising degree of leniency. But here's where the unique Spartan twist comes in. The Spartans, in their relentless pursuit of producing the strongest possible offspring for the state, sometimes held a remarkably pragmatic, almost utilitarian, view of reproduction that would have utterly scandalized the traditional Athenians. For example, if a husband was particularly old, or if a woman's husband was away for exceptionally long periods on grueling military expeditions, it was not only unheard of, but sometimes actively encouraged for a woman to have children with another man. especially one who was physically fit and robust, often with the husband's full knowledge and even explicit permission. This was generally not considered adultery in the same morally charged sense as in Athens, but rather a practical and often celebrated means to ensure a steady supply of healthy, strong offspring for the polis, the city-state. The true prevalence of this practice remains a fascinating and active area of academic debate. Was it truly widespread or limited to very specific circumstances and social classes? Was it genuinely about the benefit of the state, or did it also, perhaps subtly, offer some unexpected agency to Spartan women in their reproductive lives? What is unequivocally clear, however, is that the Spartan societal focus was overwhelmingly on the collective strength of the lineage and the polis itself, rather than individual male honor in the same intensely personal way as in Athens. So, as you slowly depart the diverse and complex world of ancient Greece, you might find yourself contemplating how, even within the same civilization, vastly different societal values could lead to remarkably divergent outcomes for women accused of the very same transgression. Drifting away from the peculiar legalities of the Hittites, you now find yourself transported to the arid, rugged landscapes of ancient Israel. Somewhere around the time of King David, perhaps a millennium or so before the Common Era, the very air here feels different, charged with a profound sense of religious duty, communal obligation, and an exceptionally strict moral code. You're not just observing laws etched on stone tablets. You're witnessing customs woven intricately into the very fabric of daily life, dictated by divine command and reinforced by community expectation. Imagine a small village nestled within the dusty Judean hills. Dust motes dance lazily in the intense sunlight filtering through narrow alleyways between mud brick homes. Life here is deeply communal, intensely focused on the extended family, the purity of lineage, and an unwavering adherence to the laws believed to be given by God to Moses. And among those numerous laws, none were perhaps as exceptionally severe or as terribly public as those concerning the act of adultery. Unlike the nuanced economic penalties of Egypt or the husband's immediate, almost personal, prerogative in Hittite lands, here, the stakes for a woman accused of infidelity were often quite literally life and death, with the entire community serving as both witness and, terrifyingly, executioner. You might stumble upon a tense, hushed scene near the village gate, the traditional place where elders would gather to dispense justice. Deuteronomy 22:22 states it with an unyielding clarity. If a man is found lying with a married woman, then both of them shall die, the man who lay with the woman and the woman. So you shall purge the evil from Israel. This wasn't a mere suggestion. It was regarded as a divine decree, a sacred command. For a married woman, infidelity wasn't simply a personal failing or a breach of trust. It was considered a profound transgression against God Himself, against her husband, and against the perceived purity and moral integrity of the entire community. Such an act was believed to risk undermining the very legitimacy of family lines, the social order, and the purity of the Israelite people in the eyes of their deity. It was, in their understanding, a grave stain that demanded absolute cleansing, and the prescribed method for this cleansing was, chillingly, often stoning. Picture the horrifying and deeply public spectacle: the accused woman, perhaps dragged unwillingly from her home, brought before the assembled community, her fate sealed by the accusation. The first stones would, according to tradition, often be cast by her accusers, then by the formal witnesses to the act, and finally by the entire community. It was designed as a communal act of purification, a horrifying visceral ritual meant to deter others from similar transgressions and to powerfully reaffirm the strict moral and religious boundaries of the society. You wouldn't find any sly legal loopholes or quiet financial settlements here. This was raw, immediate, and tragically public justice. It certainly wasn't a gentle way to drift off to sleep, was it? More like a jarring wake-up call, if anything. The actual frequency with which these severe laws, particularly stoning, were enacted in practice remains a lively and complex area of academic discussion among historians and theologians alike. While the biblical texts are clear on the prescription, some scholars propose that the strict requirements for convictions, such as the need for 2 or more reliable witnesses to the act, and the often public nature of the act, have made it difficult to carry out these sentences frequently. It's possible that local communities found alternative ways to resolve such delicate issues more quietly, especially if clear, irrefutable evidence was lacking, or if the accused woman's family held significant influence within the community. However, the compelling narrative of the woman caught in adultery in the New Testament, John 8:2, 1-11, where Jesus famously intervenes, strongly suggests that even centuries after the Deuteronomic laws were written, the threat of stoning for this specific offense was still very real, widely understood, and socially accepted within the Jewish legal framework. It vividly highlights a society where accusations could swiftly lead to immediate and tragically severe consequences. You might also observe a subtle yet profoundly significant societal double standard. While both parties involved in adultery were theoretically condemned to death by law, the focus, both in the biblical narratives and much of subsequent historical interpretation, often falls disproportionately and more heavily on the woman. Her chastity was inextricably linked to the honor of her husband, her family, and the broader community. A man's infidelity, while certainly considered sinful, generally did not carry the same devastating public shame or fundamentally threaten the purity of his lineage in the exact same way. This inherent imbalance echoed across many ancient societies, but in ancient Israel, the consequences for women were arguably among the most immediate and publicly brutal. As you slowly depart the dusty paths and stern pronouncements of ancient Israel, the sheer weight of such a communal judgment feels heavy, almost oppressive, in the quiet air. Leaving the sun-drenched marble temples and the varying social strictures of Greece, you are now gently swept westward across the cerulean waters of the Mediterranean, landing squarely in the bustling heart of the Roman Republic. A foundational period stretching roughly from 509 BC to 27 BC, the very air here is thick with the scent of ambition, civic duty, and an almost palpable, pervasive sense of respect for the power of the family unit. You are entering a society meticulously built upon tradition, an intricate body of law, and an almost sacred veneration for the paterfamilias, the undisputed male head of the household. And if you thought the Greeks had their rigidities, the Romans, in their own methodical way, possessed a unique brand of control, often more subtle and deeply ingrained, but ultimately no less potent in its societal grip. Imagine yourself immersed in the daily life of a Roman home, perhaps a relatively modest dwelling in the bustling, often chaotic, Subura district, or a grand, sprawling villa perched regally on the prestigious Palatine Hill. The family, the familia, was not just a collection of individuals, it was the sacred bedrock of Roman society, the fundamental unit upon which all civic order rested. And at its apex stood the paterfamilias, wielding immense legal authority, a power known as patria potestas. This was no mere suggestion of influence. It was a vast, almost absolute, legal dominion not only over his legitimate children, but also, surprisingly, over his wife, especially if she had married Kamanu, meaning she passed into his legal control, and even over his adult sons and their own families. In theory, he possessed the legal right even to inflict capital punishment upon members of his household. It's like being the CEO, the chief financial officer, and the chief justice all rolled into one singular, all-powerful figure with virtually unlimited tenure and unchecked authority. You would most certainly want to stay firmly on his good side, wouldn't you? Perhaps even bring him a nice, chilled jug of Posca after a long day, when it came to the deeply sensitive issue of female infidelity. The paterfamilias was undeniably the primary enforcer of justice, at least during the early and middle periods of the Republic. If a wife was discovered to have committed adultery, her husband possessed the immediate legal right to divorce her, but the consequences could extend far beyond mere marital dissolution. In more severe cases, particularly if the unfaithful wife and her lover were caught in flagranti delicto, a Latin phrase meaning in blazing crime, or caught in the very act, the paterfamilias of the offending wife, that is, her own father, not her husband, had the explicit legal right, and sometimes the societal expectation, to kill both his daughter and her lover. This was not a decision to be taken lightly. It was considered a grave and weighty act, meticulously designed to restore the family's honor, which had been profoundly stained, and it had to be carried out immediately, without any undue delay or hesitation. It's a far cry from a quiet, uncomfortable conversation and a session with a modern therapist, isn't it? The concept of honor, known as pudicitia for Roman women, was absolutely paramount. A woman's chastity and virtue were not merely her own personal attributes. They were inextricably linked to the reputation of her family, the standing of her husband, and indeed, to the broader Roman state itself. Her pudicitia guaranteed the purity of the lineage, ensuring with absolute certainty that the next generation of Roman citizens was indeed legitimate, untainted by questionable parentage. An unfaithful wife was therefore seen as deeply sullying this sacred trust, undermining the very foundation of societal order. It was less about individual passionate betrayal and more about the fundamental stability and moral integrity of the entire Roman Republic. Think of it as a complex, highly personal security system safeguarding the entire societal structure, with profoundly severe penalties for any censor that dared to trigger an alarm. The actual frequency with which the extreme right of a father to summarily kill his daughter for adultery was exercised remains a point of considerable academic debate and scholarly investigation. While the legal right undeniably existed, public opinion, the pervasive societal pressures, and the sheer practicalities of carrying out such a drastic, irreversible act would have likely made it a rare occurrence, reserved for only the most egregious and undeniable cases. Divorce was, by far, a more common outcome for female infidelity. And even then, divorce in the Republic, while generally easier to obtain than in some other ancient societies, still carried a significant social stigma, particularly for the woman. A divorced woman, especially one divorced for infidelity, might find it incredibly difficult to remarry well within her social standing, and her reputation, her fama, would be irrevocably tarnished. As the Roman Republic gradually progressed and evolved, Roman women did indeed gain a degree of increased freedom, particularly in terms of legal guardianship and the right to control their own property. Many women became sui juris, meaning of their own right, effectively free from their father's or husband's direct legal control after marriage. But the overwhelming social pressure and the weighty, enduring significance of pudictia continued to exert a powerful influence. So, while you might not have faced the same public stoning as in ancient Israel, an accusation of infidelity in the Roman Republic could still lead to a devastating social death, mercilessly enforced by the formidable power of the paterfamilias and the pervasive, unyielding Roman emphasis on family honor and societal order. As you slowly step away from this era of stern fathers, unyielding virtues, and profound family loyalty, the sense of invisible, yet incredibly strong, chains of tradition and social expectation lingers powerfully in the air. From the stern, family-centric world of the Roman Republic, where the paterfamilias reigned supreme, you now transition seamlessly into the shimmering, sprawling grandeur of imperial Rome, a monumental period commencing around 27 BC with the transformative reign of Emperor Augustus. The empire, by this era, is not merely vast, it is wealthy beyond measure, intensely complex, and deeply stratified. With this soaring complexity comes a profound shift in how Roman society and its meticulously crafted laws began to address matters of personal morality, particularly those as intimate as marital fidelity. The private, almost absolute, authority of the paterfamilias, while still fundamentally significant, gradually starts to cede ground to a greater emphasis on public law and direct state intervention, especially when it came to the very public offense of adultery. Imagine yourself now amidst the pulsating heart of a Roman forum, not just observing debates on politics or military campaigns, but perhaps witnessing a very public trial unfold before your eyes. The very air hums with the hushed whispers of cloaked senators, the rhythmic clatter of sandals on ancient cobblestones, and the distant, almost primal roar from the colossal amphitheater. Emperor Augustus, a figure deeply obsessed with revitalizing and restoring what he perceived as the traditional Roman virtues, firmly believed that a widespread moral decline had played a critical role in the ultimate downfall of the venerable republic. His ambitious solution, a series of sweeping moral laws, the most impactful of which was the infamous Lex Julia de Adulterius Coascendus, or the Julian law on the repression of adultery, formally enacted in 18 BC. This single piece of legislation was nothing short of a game-changer for Roman society. Suddenly, what had for centuries been primarily a private family matter, handled within the confines of the household or by the authority of the paterfamilias, became an undeniable public crime. Adultery was no longer merely a grievous affront to personal or familial honor. It was explicitly redefined as a severe crime against the state itself. You might find yourself scratching your head, perhaps stifling a yawn of disbelief, wondering aloud, why did the mighty Roman state suddenly care so profoundly about who was sleeping with whom? Well, for Augustus, a shrewd political operator and social engineer, it was all about promoting traditional marriage, actively discouraging the rising rates of divorce among the elite, and ensuring a continuous supply of legitimate, pure-blooded offspring to replenish and invigorate the Roman aristocracy and citizenry. It was, in essence, social engineering on an unprecedented scale, cleverly cloaked in the guise of moral righteousness and patriotic duty. He famously and ruthlessly even exiled his own brilliant and charming daughter, Julia the Elder, for what was widely deemed scandalous and morally transgressive behavior. Talk about leading by example, right? Or, perhaps, simply being an incredibly strict and unyielding father, even to the highest echelons of power. Under the stringent new provisions of the Lex Julia, a man who discovered his wife committing adultery was now legally required to divorce her. If he failed to do so, if he somehow tolerated the transgression, he could himself be prosecuted for the crime of lenocinium, which essentially meant pandering or profiting from his wife's illicit behavior. Yes, that's right, it's like the state was declaring, you're not just tolerating it, you're morally complicit in it, or even gaining from this societal ill. The law further stipulated that the wronged husband, or, crucially, the wife's own paterfamilias, if she was still under his legal authority, had a strict 60-day window to initiate a formal public prosecution against both the adulterous wife and her male lover. If they failed to bring charges within that time frame, anyone could then step forward and bring the charge. Imagine being a particularly nosy neighbor with a keen eye for societal transgressions and a burgeoning interest in legal drama. Your time to shine had truly arrived. It makes even modern neighborhood watch programs seem quaint by comparison. The penalties under the Lex Julia were severe, though notably they typically did not prescribe death, a stark contrast to some of the earlier republic's allowances for fathers. An adulterous wife would suffer immensely, losing a significant portion of her dowry and other personal property. Beyond the financial ruin, she would also be publicly relegated to a specific, stigmatized social status known as infamia, meaning she would lose her good name, her social standing, and face profound public humiliation. She might also be legally forbidden from remarrying a free-born Roman citizen, and was very often banished into exile to a remote, isolated island. Her male lover would also suffer substantial penalties, which often included the forfeiture of a portion of his property and, in many cases, exile to a different island to prevent any further illicit encounters. One assumes the actual frequency of these public trials remains a subject of ongoing academic debate among classicists. While the legal framework was certainly robust, many cases might still have been settled privately, with the Lex Julia serving primarily as a powerful legal leverage point for the wronged party. However, the very existence of such a formal, public process fundamentally and irrevocably changed the legal and social landscape for women accused of infidelity in imperial Rome. You might observe the intricate legal dance, the elaborate rhetorical flourishes of highly skilled Roman lawyers, all meticulously designed to prosecute what was once a hushed, private family tragedy. The profound idea that a woman's sexual conduct was now explicitly a matter of public legal concern, rather than solely a private domestic issue, marks a pivotal and enduring shift in Roman jurisprudence. It's almost as if the mighty Roman state, having successfully conquered so much physical territory, then decided it was time to extend its dominion and conquer the very bedrooms and private lives of its own citizens. As you slowly withdraw from the marble splendors and intricate legalities of imperial Rome, the pervasive sense of constant scrutiny, even in one's most intimate affairs, lingers palpably in the quiet air. Leaving the grandeur and intricate legalities of imperial Rome, where public virtue was legislated, you are now transported north and east, deep into the dense, misty forests, sprawling plains, and rugged terrains of ancient Europe, into the territories inhabited by the diverse early Germanic tribes, roughly spanning from the 1st to the 5th centuries AD. The air here feels raw, untamed, and uniquely infused with the primal scent of wood smoke, damp earth, and perhaps a hint of fermenting mead. This isn't a world of meticulously written laws, etched on grand stone tablets, or sophisticated legal precedents argued in a forum. This is a society primarily governed by unwritten, deeply ingrained customs, robust oral traditions, and a fiercely personal sense of honor that often demanded immediate, and frequently brutal, satisfaction. Imagine a small Germanic settlement nestled within a clearing, a close-knit cluster of sturdy wooden longhouses, their roofs thatched with straw, often surrounded by a defensive palisade of sharpened logs. Life here is intensely communal, based firmly on kinship groups and the strong bonds of clan, and profoundly intertwined with the cyclical rhythms of farming, the constant readiness for warfare, and the harsh, unforgiving realities of sheer survival. Justice, in this societal framework, isn't formally dispensed in a structured courtroom by robed magistrates or eloquent orators. Instead, it's typically administered directly by the injured party, or by the community's venerable elders gathered in an open assembly, with a prevailing focus on restoring a perceived balance. Often, unfortunately, through direct and sometimes violent means. There's a stark, pragmatic directness to their form of justice, a striking and visceral contrast to the elaborate legal labyrinth you just navigated in Rome. It's almost like moving from a game of chess to a game of very high-stakes rock paper scissors, where losing means much more than just a bruised ego. When it came to the deeply sensitive and honor-bound issue of female infidelity, the various Germanic tribes possessed particularly harsh and undeniably public, albeit often informal, systems of punishment. You might, to your discomfort, witness a scene unfolding that sends an undeniable shiver down your spine. A woman accused of adultery, her head brutally shaved, a profound act of public degradation, perhaps stripped of her clothes, and possibly even flogged, before being ignominiously driven out of her husband's house and cast out from the community. This was not a mere divorce or separation. It was a devastating, ritualistic act of shaming and outright expulsion, often carried out in front of the entire assembled community. It represented a complete and utter stripping away of her identity, her social standing, and her very dignity. It's a bit like an ancient, profoundly unforgiving walk of shame, but without the benefit of a redemptive arc or a cinematic swelling of background music. The renowned Roman historian Tacitus, in his influential ethnographic work, Germania, composed around 98 AD, offers a chilling and widely cited description of a specific custom regarding adulterous women among the Germanic peoples. Adultery is a rare thing among that numerous population. The woman who has been guilty of it has her hair cut off by the husband in the presence of relatives, and is driven naked from his house through the whole village, pursued with blows. This account, while stemming from an outsider's perspective, and potentially colored by Roman biases or generalizations, nonetheless paints a vivid and undeniably grim picture of the sheer humiliation and physical abuse involved. The ritualistic loss of hair was deeply symbolic and significant for women in many ancient cultures, as it was often seen as a potent emblem of a woman's honor, her status, and her beauty. To have it shorn publicly was to be ritually disfigured, stripped of worth, and marked as an outcast. Beyond this profound public shaming, there was also the widely accepted, customary right of the wronged husband to kill both his unfaithful wife and her male lover if they were caught in the very act in flagrante delicto. This was considered an entirely accepted and lawful part of their customary law, not merely a spontaneous act of uncontrolled rage. It was a right deeply rooted in the paramount concept of personal and familial honor and the husband's perceived ownership or absolute right over his wife's fidelity. unlike Roman law, which, by the imperial period, often required a formal public trial. Here, the husband's immediate, violent vengeance was largely unchangeable and implicitly sanctioned by the community's unwritten laws. You would certainly want to avoid being the subject of such a sudden, fiery, and utterly irreversible outburst, wouldn't you? It definitely raises the bar for awkward encounters. At social gatherings, the universality of Tacitus's account of these specific punishments across all the myriad Germanic tribes remains an active area of scholarly debate among historians, and there was immense linguistic, cultural, and customary diversity among these numerous groups, and specific practices could vary widely from one tribe or region to another. Some scholars cautiously suggest that the extremely severe nature of these customs likely meant they were rare in actual practice, serving primarily as a terrifying and highly effective deterrent. However, the underlying principle was undeniably clear and consistently present. Female chastity was of paramount importance, and its perceived violation could, and often did, lead to extreme, immediate, and publicly brutal consequences administered directly by the aggrieved husband or through the collective, shaming will of the community. As you slowly depart the raw, untamed world of the early Germanic tribes, the starkness of their unwritten laws and the overwhelming power of communal honor feel like a chilling, almost primal echo in the quiet, ancient air. Having traversed the rugged, honor-driven lands of the early Germanic tribes, you now find yourself drifting across the choppy, frigid waters of the North Sea, landing amidst the mist-shrouded fjords and bustling longhouses of the Viking Age. Roughly from the late 8th to the mid-11th centuries, the air here is sharp with the tang of salt spray, wood smoke, and the distant calls of gulls. This isn't a society defined by elaborate legal codes carved in stone, but by fiercely independent chieftains, strong oral traditions, and the complex, often surprisingly practical, concept of the thing, a communal assembly where disputes were settled. Imagine a scene at a local thing assembly in a remote Icelandic valley or a Norwegian coastal settlement. Men and women gather, discussing trade, land disputes, and, inevitably, matters of family honor, while the popular image of Vikings might lean towards raiding and pillaging. Their internal societal structure had a nuanced approach to marriage and its breakdown. Viking women, particularly those of free status, enjoyed a considerable degree of autonomy and legal rights, compared to many of their contemporaries in other parts of Europe. They could own property, manage estates in their husband's absence, and even initiate divorce. This wasn't a world where women were merely chattel. They were vital partners in the household and the broader community. When it came to infidelity, the Viking approach was often less about state-mandated execution and more about compensation, social standing, and the right to dissolve the marriage. While the sagas, those rich narratives of Viking life, sometimes hint at husbands taking violent vengeance on a wife's lover, formal legal structures usually emphasized financial restitution or divorce. If a wife was caught in adultery, her husband certainly had grounds for immediate divorce. The key here was often the economic fallout. The unfaithful wife could lose her dowry and any property she brought into the marriage. It was less about a public shaming ritual akin to the Germanic tribes and more about a breach of a contractual agreement, with financial penalties. It's like a very, very old and much more dramatic prenup gone wrong. However, the consequences for the lover could be far more severe. The wronged husband had the right to demand compensation known as wergeld, or man money from the lover. essentially a fine for the damage done to his honor and household. If this compensation wasn't paid, or if the husband chose to forego it, he could, in some regions and under certain circumstances, legally kill the lover without facing blood feud repercussions. This right to vengeance was highly conditional and needed to be carried out within strict legal frameworks, often requiring the husband to publicly declare his intent at the thing. It's a bit like announcing your intentions on a particularly serious social media platform, but with swords instead of angry emojis. A fascinating aspect of Viking law was the concept of honorable divorce. A woman could divorce her husband for a variety of reasons, including impotence, constant physical abuse, or even simply if he wore effeminate clothing. Yes, seriously, that was a valid reason in some codes. This level of agency for women to dissolve a marriage themselves stands in stark contrast to many other ancient societies. For a wife, however, being divorced for infidelity would still carry significant social stigma and financial loss, even if it didn't mean a public stoning. Academic discussions continue regarding the exact prevalence of these divorce laws and the severity with which infidelity was punished. While the sagas often dramatize the more violent acts of vengeance, legal texts suggest that financial settlements and formal divorces were the more common, albeit still devastating, outcomes. The focus in Viking society was on the maintenance of social order and the resolution of disputes, often through compensation, to avoid endless cycles of blood feuds. So, as you leave the longboats and ice-kissed shores of the Viking Age, you might appreciate the nuanced, often pragmatic, legal framework that allowed for a surprising degree of female agency, even amidst the harsh realities of a warrior culture. Just remember to always dress appropriately. From the rugged, windswept shores of the Viking Age, where honor and pragmatic law intertwined, you are now gently carried eastward and southward, landing amidst the sophisticated, often labyrinthian courts and vibrant mosaics of the Byzantine Empire, a colossal civilization that emerged from the ashes of the Western Roman Empire and endured for over a millennium. From the 4th to the 15th centuries AD, the air here is rich with the scent of incense, parchment, and political intrigue. This isn't just a continuation of Roman law. It's Roman law infused, shaped, and fundamentally reinterpreted by the pervasive influence of Christianity. Imagine yourself in the magnificent city of Constantinople, the new Rome, a glittering metropolis spanning 2 continents. You're standing amidst the awe-inspiring Hagia Sophia, the grand basilica radiating spiritual authority. Or perhaps observing a bustling court where robed officials meticulously pore over legal codices. The Byzantine Empire, particularly under the towering figure of Emperor Justinian I in the 6th century, undertook a monumental task: the compilation and rationalization of centuries of Roman law into what became the Corpus Juris Civilis, body of civil law. This wasn't just a dusty legal textbook. It was the foundation of European legal thought for centuries to come. And within its pages lay the explicit rules for dealing with infidelity. Under Byzantine law, mirroring the imperial Roman shift we explored, adultery was unequivocally treated as a serious public crime, not merely a private family affair. The influence of Christian doctrine, which condemned adultery as a grave sin, reinforced and often intensified the legal prohibitions. For a woman, being found guilty of adultery carried exceptionally severe consequences, often culminating in imprisonment or banishment. Justinian's laws, for instance, stipulated that an adulterous wife could be confined to a monastery for life, or for a specified period, often for penance. This wasn't just a quiet retreat. It was a form of incarceration, a stripping away of freedom and societal interaction. You wouldn't find any holiday brochures advertising that particular kind of monastic getaway, would you? The law was quite specific about the punishment for the male lover as well. While he might not face the same monastic confinement, he could suffer severe physical penalties, including public flogging, mutilation such as the cutting off of his nose, or even castration. These were not symbolic gestures. They were brutal acts designed to publicly humiliate and incapacitate. Imagine trying to explain that particular injury to your friends at the public baths. Interestingly, while the legal framework was harsh, there were also provisions for forgiveness. If a wronged husband chose to reconcile with his unfaithful wife, he could petition the emperor to allow her release from the monastery. This element of potential clemency, rooted in Christian ideals of forgiveness, offered a small glimmer of hope, though it was entirely dependent on the husband's willingness to forgive and the emperor's approval. Historians often debate whether the monastic punishment was genuinely about religious penance or primarily a convenient state-sanctioned way to remove undesirable women from society without resorting to outright execution. Moreover, Byzantine society, despite its rigid legal codes, was also marked by a thriving urban life and complex social interactions, particularly among the elite. While the laws were clear, the actual application could vary depending on social status, wealth, and influence. A wealthy or well-connected woman might find ways to navigate the legal system more favorably than a woman of humble origins. The pervasive presence of eunuchs in the imperial court also added another layer of intrigue and subtle dynamics to gender relations, though that's a story for another sleep-inducing historical dive. So, as you slowly withdraw from the gilded domes and complex legal scrolls of the Byzantine Empire, the profound fusion of Roman legal tradition with Christian moral doctrine becomes strikingly clear. It was a world where piety and law dictated severe consequences for female infidelity, often leading to a life of forced spiritual contemplation, or at least confinement. Leaving the intricate, church-influenced legal system of the Byzantine Empire, where monastic confinement was a prescribed consequence, you are now transported westward to the fragmented, often tumultuous landscapes of medieval Europe, specifically. Navigating the complex and pervasive world of the church courts, roughly from the 11th to the 15th centuries, the air here is thick with the scent of wood smoke, damp earth, and the undeniable, omnipresent authority of the Roman Catholic Church, which, for better or worse, permeated every aspect of life, from the grandest king's decree to the humblest peasant's daily routine. Imagine yourself in a dimly lit, echoing cathedral, perhaps in a bustling city like Paris or London. This isn't a secular court of kings or feudal lords. This is a court of bishops and archdeacons, administering what was known as canon law, the law of the church. While secular courts dealt with crimes against the state or property, the church courts held sway over matters of morality, marriage, inheritance, and, crucially, sins like adultery. For the medieval mind, sin was not just a personal failing. It was an offense against God, and the church was God's earthly representative, tasked with judging and, ideally, bringing souls to repentance. When it came to female infidelity, the church's stance was unequivocal. It was a mortal sin, a grave violation of the sacrament of marriage, which was considered an unbreakable bond instituted by God. A woman found guilty of adultery faced not just earthly punishment, but also the terrifying prospect of eternal damnation. However, the Church's approach to earthly punishment differed significantly from the often brutal, physical penalties of earlier pagan societies. Instead of stoning or banishment to a remote island, the Church favored spiritual and public penance. You might be ordered to perform public acts of contrition, perhaps wear a distinctive mark or clothing to denote your sin, or even undertake a pilgrimage. It's a bit like being sentenced to endless community service, but with existential dread. For dessert, the church courts often aimed for reconciliation rather than outright punitive destruction of the marriage, especially in earlier periods. While adultery was grounds for divorce, a mensa ethero, separation from bed and board, meaning the couple lived apart but could not remarry. It was not grounds for a full divorce, a vincular matrimony annulment, which would declare the marriage invalid from the start. The ideal was for the sinner to repent, confess, and be reintegrated into the community, often after a period of public humiliation and penance. Imagine having to stand at the church door during Sunday Mass, visible to everyone as a living sermon. On sign, the specific penalties varied widely depending on the region, the social status of the accused, and the individual bishop or judge. A noblewoman might face a period of forced confinement in a convent, while a peasant woman might be subjected to public shaming and a loss of local standing. Interestingly, medieval church courts, while stern on adultery, also had to contend with the widespread phenomenon of concubinage and various forms of extramarital relationships that were often tolerated in secular society, particularly for men. This created a tension between strict canon law and the messy realities of medieval life. Academic debate continues regarding the actual effectiveness and uniformity of these church court judgments. While the church's authority was vast, its ability to enforce every decree, especially over powerful lords or widespread local customs, was sometimes limited. Records show instances where secular authorities ignored or even defied church rulings. Moreover, the emphasis on public penance could be both a powerful deterrent and, for some, an opportunity for genuine spiritual reflection, or perhaps just a very long, very awkward walk. So, as you wander through the echoing silence of a medieval cathedral, the pervasive weight of both sin and salvation, and the Church's complex role in governing private lives, feels incredibly tangible. Having explored the omnipresent influence of the church courts in medieval Europe, with their focus on spiritual penance and public shaming, you now glide smoothly into the particular realm of feudal France, specifically examining the often brutal and deeply localized penalties for infidelity that characterized this era, roughly from the 9th to the 15th centuries. The air here is no longer thick with incense and scholarly debate. Instead, you sense the rigid stratification of feudal society, the clang of armor, and the earthy smell of manorial life, where local lords held sway with varying degrees of autonomy. Imagine yourself in a small, walled French village, perhaps somewhere in Normandy or Burgundy. Life is dictated by the rhythm of the seasons, the authority of the local lord, and the pervasive fear of famine or invasion. While the church certainly held moral authority, the actual enforcement of laws, particularly those related to social transgressions like infidelity, often fell to the secular power of the local lord or baron. And these lords, eager to maintain order and enforce their personal honor within their domains, often prescribed punishments that were swift, visible, and deeply humiliating, sometimes even fatal, when a woman was accused of infidelity in feudal France. her fate could vary wildly, depending on the specific customs of the region, the social standing of her husband, and, crucially, the temperament of the local lord. Unlike the systematic legal codes we've seen in Rome or Byzantium, feudal justice was often decentralized and highly personal. For a noblewoman, discovery of infidelity could lead to public disgrace, forced entry into a convent, sometimes with the loss of all her property to her family or husband, or even, in extreme cases, imprisonment. For women of lower social status, the punishments could be far more visceral and immediate. You might, for example, encounter accounts of women being publicly shamed, stripped, or paraded through the village. One particularly grim, though perhaps apocryphal, medieval custom involved leading the accused woman, sometimes astride a donkey, through the streets, accompanied by jeers and insults, her hair shorn, or some other mark of shame prominently displayed. This was designed not just to punish the individual, but to serve as a stark warning to the entire community. It's like a medieval reality show where the stakes were truly devastating, and the cancellation was permanent. Another brutal form of punishment, recorded in some regional customs, was the mutilation of the woman's nose or ears. This was meant to permanently disfigure her, making her a recognizable outcast, a living testament to her transgression. For the male lover, the consequences were often equally, if not more, severe, ranging from castration, blinding, or even execution, depending on the lord's will and the status of the wronged husband. The underlying rationale was to protect the husband's honor and ensure the legitimacy of heirs, as in many ancient societies, but here administered with often savage efficiency. Academic debate continues regarding the actual frequency and widespread application of these more extreme forms of punishment. While such customs are documented in legal texts and chronicles, their commonality in everyday life is less clear. Many cases might have been resolved through less dramatic means, such as financial settlements or private banishment, especially if the families involved had power or influence. However, the threat of such brutal and public retribution undeniably hung over medieval women, a constant reminder of the societal premium placed on fidelity and honor, the dual authority of church and secular law often led to overlapping jurisdictions and sometimes conflicting penalties. A woman might face penance in a church court and then still be subject to a lord's secular punishment. It was a complex, often bewildering landscape of justice where local power often superseded broader moral principles. So, as you leave the fortified walls and muddy paths of feudal France, the harsh realities of decentralized justice and the intense focus on local honor loom large in your mind. Having navigated the fragmented, often brutal landscape of feudal France and its localized justice, you now glide across the narrow English Channel to the evolving legal landscape of English common law. Tracing its origins from the Norman conquest in 1066 through the early modern period, the air here feels damp, perhaps a little cooler, and infused with the scent of burgeoning towns and the quiet, steady development of a legal system that would eventually spread across a significant portion of the globe. This isn't a realm of immediate personal vengeance by a lord, nor exclusively the spiritual penance of the church. It's the gradual emergence of a more systematic, albeit still strict, legal framework. Imagine yourself in an English village, perhaps around the 13th or 14th century. A man and woman are discussing a new legal precedent set in the royal courts. While local customs and manorial courts still played a significant role, the Norman kings began to establish a centralized royal justice system building the foundations of what would become common law. This system, relying on judicial precedent, rather than purely unwritten codes, slowly but surely began to standardize legal practices across the kingdom. And as this system developed, so too did the legal understanding of marital infidelity. Initially, in early common law, adultery was primarily seen as a matter for the church courts, falling under the umbrella of sin and morality. The secular courts were generally reluctant to intervene directly unless it involved a clear breach of the peace or a property dispute. However, as the centuries progressed, particularly from the 16th century onwards, English common law began to shift its focus, treating adultery less as a purely criminal offense with direct state-imposed punishment for the act itself, and more as a civil wrong, specifically a tort. This might sound like a subtle legal distinction, but it had profound consequences for women accused of infidelity. You see, for a wronged husband, adultery primarily became actionable as a civil claim known as criminal conversation, often shortened to crim khan. This wasn't a criminal charge against the wife or her lover that would lead to imprisonment or physical punishment by the state. Instead, it was a lawsuit filed by the husband against the male lover, seeking financial damages for the theft of his wife's affection and consortium, and for the damage to his honor and the legitimacy of his heirs. It's almost like suing someone for stealing your prize-winning livestock, but the livestock here is your wife's fidelity. The wife herself, being considered legally subordinate to her husband, a legal concept known as femme covert, could not be sued and had very little legal standing in the case herself. She was often merely an object of the lawsuit, her reputation, however, utterly ruined. It's a bit like a spectator in your own public trial, where everyone's talking about you, but not to you. While the crim khan action didn't directly punish the woman with state-sanctioned violence, the social consequences were devastating. A woman found to have committed adultery would almost certainly be divorced, losing her dower rights, her right to support from her husband's property after his death or divorce, and facing profound social ostracism. She would be seen as morally corrupt, effectively unmarriable to anyone of good standing, and often alienated from her family. Her life, for all intents and purposes, was socially ruined. Academic debate continues regarding the extent to which these crim khan suits were common, or if they were primarily a tool for wealthy husbands seeking public vindication and substantial financial compensation. Records suggest they certainly gained prominence during the Georgian and Victorian eras, often becoming sensationalized public spectacles that exposed the intimate details of marital breakdown. However, for the majority of the population, more informal resolutions or simply quiet separation likely remained prevalent. So, as you move through the intricate, evolving world of English common law, the shift from divine punishment to financial compensation for a wronged husband marks a fascinating, if still deeply patriarchal, legal evolution. It's a system where the punishment for women, while less physically brutal than in some past societies, was often a slow, agonizing social death. From the evolving common law of England, where infidelity became a tort with financial repercussions, you are now transported far eastward, to the vibrant, scholarly, and profoundly spiritual world of the Islamic Golden Age, roughly spanning from the 8th to the 13th centuries AD. The air here is rich with the scent of spices, the murmur of scholarly discourse, and the majestic call to prayer echoing from minarets. This isn't a realm of localized feudal lords or centralized secular courts in the European sense. It's a civilization guided by the comprehensive and divinely revealed principles of Sharia law, derived from the Quran and the Sunnah, the traditions and practices of Prophet Muhammad. Imagine yourself in a bustling Baghdad marketplace, a center of learning and commerce, where scholars, merchants, and artisans from across continents mingle freely. The legal system, unlike many of its contemporaries, was unified by a shared set of religious principles aiming to govern all aspects of life, from prayer and charity to commerce and, of course, personal morality, including marriage and fidelity. For Muslims, marriage is a sacred contract, a bond of mutual rights and responsibilities, and its sanctity is fiercely protected by law and faith. When it came to the grave matter of adultery known as zina in Islamic jurisprudence, Sharia law prescribed exceedingly severe, divinely ordained penalties. Unlike the more varied responses we've seen, here the punishment was theoretically fixed and extreme. The Quran, alongside prophetic traditions, details specific penalties for illicit sexual relations. For married individuals referred to as muhsan, the prescribed punishment was stoning to death. For unmarried individuals, the punishment was 100 lashes. These were known as hudded punishments, meaning they were considered rights of God, fixed and unchangeable. You wouldn't find a casual bypass around these regulations. They were seen as divine commands. It certainly adds a whole new dimension to taking your vows seriously, doesn't it? However, and this is a crucial nuance often overlooked, the evidential requirements for proving zina were extraordinarily stringent, making convictions incredibly rare in practice. To prove adultery, Islamic law typically required the testimony of 4 adult, sane, Muslim male witnesses who had personally observed the act of penetration without any doubt or ambiguity. Alternatively, it could be proven by a confession from the accused, made freely and repeatedly. The bar for conviction was so impossibly high that it was almost impossible to meet. Imagine trying to gather for witnesses who literally saw everything and were willing to testify to it. It's a bit like trying to find a unicorn playing a lute while simultaneously reciting ancient poetry, theoretically possible, but practically improbable. If a husband accused his wife of zina, but could not produce the 4 witnesses, he himself could face punishment for slander QADHF, which carried a penalty of 80 lashes. This was designed to protect individuals from baseless accusations and to encourage a high standard of proof before such a grave charge could be leveled. In cases where a husband accused his wife and had no witnesses, a special procedure called lion could be invoked, involving a series of solemn oaths sworn by both parties before God, effectively separating the couple. Academic discussions highlight that while the hudded punishments for zina were enshrined in theory, their actual implementation was exceedingly rare throughout Islamic history, precisely because of these stringent evidentiary requirements. Most historical cases of illicit sexual behavior were dealt with through discretionary punishments, ta'zir, administered by judges, which could involve imprisonment, fines, or lighter lashings, but rarely death. These ta'zir punishments were tailored to the specific circumstances and aimed more at societal order and reform than divine retribution. So, as you move through the scholarly mosques and bustling souk of the Islamic Golden Age, you might find a surprising disconnect between the theoretical severity of the law and its practical application, a testament to a legal system that often prioritized justice and due process, even in the face of profound moral transgressions. From the scholarly Sharia-governed cities of the Islamic Golden Age, where strict evidentiary rules made extreme punishments rare, You were now transported across vast oceans to the vibrant, complex civilizations of the pre-Columbian Americas, specifically focusing on the formidable Aztec Empire, which flourished in Mesoamerica from roughly the 14th to the early 16th centuries. The air here is rich with the scent of copal incense, the earthy aroma of maize, and the distant rhythmic drum beats from the grand temples of Tenochtitlan. This isn't a realm of European legal traditions or Abrahamic religious codes. It's a unique indigenous society with its own intricate legal system, deeply interwoven with cosmology, social hierarchy, and a strict moral order enforced by a powerful state. Imagine yourself in the awe-inspiring capital of Tenochtitlan, a magnificent city built on an island in the middle of a lake, crisscrossed by canals and teeming with hundreds of thousands of people. You might be observing a bustling marketplace where goods from across the empire are traded, or perhaps the serene floating gardens, chinampas, that feed this vast population. Beneath this impressive veneer of urban life and agricultural ingenuity lay a meticulously structured society with a very clear and often brutal system of justice. Aztec law, though not codified in the same way as Roman or Islamic law, was administered through a hierarchy of courts, ranging from local tribunals to high imperial courts. And it was particularly unforgiving when it came to offenses that threatened the social fabric, such as adultery. When a woman was accused of infidelity in Aztec society, the consequences were exceptionally severe and often fatal. Particularly for noble women, adultery, known as tetzawisli, was considered a grave offense, not just against the immediate family, but against the moral order of the entire community and, by extension, against the gods. It was seen as a disruptive act that could bring cosmic imbalance. Unlike the often nuanced legal systems of other cultures, the Aztec approach was startlingly direct and punitive. You might hear whispers of the public punishments meted out. For a commoner, an adulterous wife and her lover could be publicly strangled or even stoned to death. For the nobility, the punishment was often even more humiliating and symbolic. They might be flayed alive or strangled, and their bodies displayed as a warning. The severity was partly due to the emphasis on lineage and the purity of noble bloodlines. Imagine the chilling spectacle of such a public execution, designed not just to punish the individuals, but to reinforce the absolute authority of the state and the gods. It certainly wasn't an era for quiet, discreet transgressions. It's a bit like having your dirty laundry aired on the biggest, most unforgiving public stage imaginable, with the added bonus of, well, no longer needing laundry. The husband of the adulterous woman also played a critical role. He had the right to bring the accusation, and if proven, he was expected to carry out the punishment or oversee it. The focus was heavily on the woman's transgression, as her fidelity was key to the legitimacy of heirs and the maintenance of social order. While men could also face penalties for certain sexual offenses, like rape or seduction of unmarried noblewomen, the consequences for male infidelity, especially with women of lower status, were generally less severe and rarely involved capital punishment, highlighting a distinct gender double standard. Academic discussions often delve into the true prevalence of these extreme punishments, while Spanish chroniclers, who are our primary source, often emphasize the brutality of Aztec justice. The day-to-day reality might have involved more frequent, less lethal forms of public shaming or banishment, particularly for lesser offenses or when circumstances were mitigating. However, the legal and moral framework clearly stipulated these harsh penalties as the ultimate recourse. The strictness of the Aztec legal system, driven by a deeply ingrained sense of cosmic order and social purity, made infidelity a truly perilous path. As you leave the grand causeways and sacred precincts of Tenochtitlan, the intense focus on communal morality and the severity of its enforcement leave a powerful, somber impression. From the structured, severe world of the Aztec Empire, where cosmic balance was enforced through strict laws, you are now transported high into the majestic Andes Mountains, to the awe-inspiring realm of the Inca Empire, which dominated vast stretches of South America from the 13th to the early 16th centuries. The air here is thin, crisp, and filled with the silent grandeur of towering peaks and meticulously engineered terraced farms. This isn't a society built on bustling markets and complex legal texts, but rather on an unparalleled system of communal organization, centralized authority, and a rigid moral code enforced through meticulous record-keeping and a profound respect for state order. Imagine yourself in the heart of Cusco, the Inca capital, a city built with stones so perfectly fitted, you can't slip a knife between them. You see no money, no markets in the European sense. Instead, goods are distributed, labor is meticulously organized, and every aspect of life is governed by a powerful, benevolent yet absolute emperor, the Sapa Inca, considered a divine descendant of the sun god. Society was structured around the Alu, a communal kinship group, and a strict moral code of Ama Swa, Ama Lula, Ama Quella, do not steal, do not lie, do not be lazy. To this, one might unofficially add, and definitely do not commit adultery. When it came to female infidelity, the Inca response was characterized by its communal approach and an unyielding emphasis on maintaining social order and the integrity of the family unit, which was foundational to the Ilu system. Adultery, like most transgressions, was viewed as a crime against the state and the communal harmony it sought to preserve. Unlike the Aztecs' often public, ritualistic executions, Inca punishments, while severe, were typically carried out with an almost bureaucratic efficiency aimed at restoring order rather than theatrical display. You might hear hushed accounts of the consequences. For commoners, an adulterous woman and her lover faced severe penalties. While stoning was known, a common punishment was for the individuals to be hurled off a cliff or publicly hanged. The method of execution varied by region and the severity of the perceived disruption, but the outcome was invariably fatal. This wasn't a matter of personal vengeance. It was a state-sanctioned act to purge the imbalance from the collective. It's like being caught cheating on the ultimate cosmic group project, where the grade is your life, and the teacher is omnipotent. For women of the Lacuna, or chosen women, virgins dedicated to the sun god, or serving the Inca elite, adultery was an even more egregious offense. Their purity was paramount to the state's religious and political legitimacy. An Akla found to be unfaithful, or even merely unchaste, faced immediate and brutal execution, often alongside her entire family and even the guards of her institution, a chilling reminder of the collective responsibility under Inca law. It demonstrates the almost unfathomable stakes attached to female chastity within this highly centralized, theocratic society. The husband, in Inca society, also had the right and expectation to report infidelity. While men could have multiple wives or concubines, strict monogamy was expected of women within their unions. Male infidelity, particularly with unattached women, was generally not met with the same severity as female adultery, again highlighting a clear gender double standard that permeated many ancient cultures. However, male rape or seduction of a married woman could still result in severe punishment, though rarely death for the man, unless he violated a chosen woman. Academic discussions continue to explore the nuances of Inca justice, particularly given that our primary sources are often from Spanish chroniclers who might have misinterpreted or exaggerated certain aspects of Inca law through their own cultural lens. However, the overarching picture remains clear. The Inca Empire, with its unparalleled social engineering and absolute emphasis on collective order, viewed female infidelity as a fundamental threat to its intricate structure, meriting the ultimate penalty. As you descend from the breathtaking heights of the Andes, the chilling efficiency of Inca law and the pervasive weight of communal expectation linger long after the thin mountain air dissipates. From the lofty, communal strictures of the Inca Empire, where every action resonated with the state, you now find yourself transported across the vast Pacific, landing in the ancient, deeply hierarchical world of Ming Dynasty China, a period of immense cultural flourishing and strict social order, spanning from 1368 to 1644 AD. The air here is fragrant with blooming plum blossoms, the scent of delicate teas, and the rhythmic brushstrokes of scholars practicing calligraphy. This isn't a realm of divine kings in the Western sense, nor is it a patchwork of independent tribal laws. It's a meticulously organized imperial bureaucracy, heavily influenced by Confucian moral principles and a long history of codified law. Imagine yourself in a bustling Ming-era city like Nanjing, or perhaps Beijing, its grand imperial palace imposing against the sky. Life is governed by a complex web of familial duties, social etiquette, and the omnipresent reach of the imperial legal system. For centuries, Chinese law had placed a paramount emphasis on maintaining social harmony, filial piety, and the stability of the family unit, which was seen as a microcosm of the state itself. The purity of lineage and the continuity of the male family line were absolutely critical, a principle that profoundly shaped the legal approach to infidelity. When a woman was accused of infidelity in Ming Dynasty China, the consequences were severe, deeply shameful, and designed to uphold the patriarchal family structure. Adultery, known as tungjian, was unequivocally treated as a serious crime, punishable by law. The primary legal code of the era, the Da Ming El Great Ming Code, meticulously detailed the various offenses and their corresponding penalties. Unlike some Western societies where the husband might take direct vengeance, in China, the state's legal apparatus was the primary enforcer. You might hear whispers from the local yamen, the magistrate's court, about cases of infidelity. For an adulterous wife, the prescribed punishment was typically 100 blows with the heavy bamboo stick, a brutal and potentially lethal form of corporal punishment. Her male lover would face the same penalty. This was a public form of degradation and physical torment, designed not just to inflict pain but to mark the individuals with lasting shame. It's like being publicly caned for a betrayal, a truly painful reminder that societal rules were not to be trifled with. However, the legal situation was notably different depending on the status of the woman and the specifics of the act. If a man raped a married woman, he would be executed by decapitation, and the woman would often be considered a victim rather than an adulterer, though she might still face social stigma. If a married woman initiated the adultery or willingly participated, she shared the same penalty as her lover. But the gender double standard was stark. While a wife's infidelity was a severe crime, a husband's extramarital affairs, particularly with courtesans or concubines, were generally tolerated and even legal. provided he didn't infringe upon the rights of his primary wife or disrupt the main family lineage. His behavior was certainly not subject to the same legal scrutiny or physical punishment. It's a bit like a game where only half the players are given the rulebook, and the other half just make it up as they go along. Moreover, while the Ming El prescribed these penalties, local customs and family honor played immense roles. A family might, out of a desire to avoid public scandal and maintain their reputation, deal with infidelity privately, sometimes resorting to harsh domestic punishments or forcing the woman to commit suicide. The legal code itself acknowledged the husband's right to divorce his unfaithful wife, and this was often a primary outcome, along with the loss of any dowry or property rights for the woman. Academic debates often explore the actual frequency of such brutal judicial corporal punishments versus the more common outcomes of divorce or informal familial resolutions. While the code was explicit, the practicalities of evidence and the desire to avoid public disgrace might have led to many cases being handled away from the official court. The pervasive influence of Confucian ethics, emphasizing strict moral conduct and filial piety, underscored these laws, making female fidelity not just a legal matter, but a moral imperative enforced by both state and family. So, as you leave the ancient imperial pathways of Ming Dynasty China, the profound weight of codified tradition and the stark realities of gender inequality leave a lasting, sobering impression. From the intricate, Confucian-influenced legal system of Ming Dynasty China, with its heavy bamboo blows and emphasis on lineage, you are now transported across the East China Sea to the fascinating and often insular world of feudal Japan, a period marked by the rise of the samurai, the elegance of the imperial court, and the strict adherence to social hierarchy, generally spanning from the 12th to the mid-19th centuries. The air here carries the delicate scent of cherry blossoms in spring, or perhaps the sharp tang of steel from a samurai's forge alongside the profound silence of Zen gardens. This isn't a realm dominated by a single, vast legal code in the same way as China, but rather by the shifting power of shoguns, local daimyos, feudal lords, and a deeply ingrained emphasis on honor, loyalty, and the meticulous maintenance of social order. Imagine yourself in a tranquil Japanese village, perhaps nestled in the shadow of a daimyo's castle, or within the bustling streets of Kyoto or Edo modern-day Tokyo. Life is rigorously structured by social class, samurai, farmers, artisans, merchants, and by an intricate web of personal duties and obligations. For women, particularly, their status and role were defined by their family and their marriage, and the concept of shame, haji, held immense power, often outweighing formal legal punishment. When a woman was accused of infidelity in feudal Japan, the consequences were predominantly driven by the concept of family honor and their husband's right to uphold it. Unlike many Western societies, where the state or church might take the lead in prosecuting adultery, in Japan, the husband, as head of the household, held significant, often ultimate, authority in dealing with such a transgression. The matter was typically considered a private affair, handled within the family unit, though the social ramifications could be devastatingly public. You might hear hushed rumors of a scandal. For an adulterous wife, the most common and immediate consequence was divorce. However, this divorce was not simply a legal separation. It carried profound social disgrace, fujoku, that would follow her for the rest of her life. She would likely be cast out by her family, unable to remarry into respectable society, and might be forced into a life of poverty or even prostitution. It was a social death sentence, a complete stripping away of her identity and standing. It's like being completely disowned by your entire social network, with absolutely no chance of ever getting read-friended. For the male lover, the situation was often far more perilous. The wronged husband, particularly if he was a samurai, had the legal right to kill the lover, and, in some periods, and under certain circumstances, even his own wife if he caught them in flagrante delicto in the act. This was known as kirasut gomen, literally, permission to cut down and walk away, a specific privilege granted to samurai to instantly kill anyone who insulted their honor. While this right was meant for specific, grave insults, it was often interpreted broadly in cases of adultery. Imagine the chilling sense of absolute, immediate justice in such a scenario with no court of appeal. However, the application of kirasut gomen for adultery was not always straightforward and could vary by period and region. Some laws required the husband to report the incident to authorities afterward, and if he had acted without clear proof, he could face penalties himself. Moreover, for commoners, while a husband might take violent action, the primary legal recourse was usually divorce and public disgrace rather than sanctioned killing. The societal focus was heavily on the husband's honor and the legitimacy of his lineage. A wife's fidelity was fundamental to this. Academic discussions often explore the nuanced role of informal social pressure versus formal legal codes in feudal Japan. While formal laws existed, the powerful cultural emphasis on shame, loyalty, and reputation meant that even without direct legal punishment, the social consequences of infidelity were immense. The very idea of bringing public disgrace upon one's family was often a more potent deterrent than any written statute. So, as you leave the intricate wooden homes and serene gardens of feudal Japan, the profound weight of family honor and the devastating power of social shame leave a truly lasting impression. From the intricate, honor-bound society of feudal Japan, where shame could be a greater punishment than law, you are now transported across vast continents to the diverse, vibrant lands of sub-Saharan Africa, a region encompassing countless unique cultures and kingdoms, particularly from ancient times through the medieval period and beyond. The air here is often warm, humid, and carries the earthy scent of red soil, distant cooking fires, and the rhythmic pulse of daily life. This isn't a single, unified empire, but a kaleidoscope of societies, each with its own rich tapestry of customary laws, oral traditions, and communal practices, where justice was often intertwined with spiritual beliefs, ancestral wisdom, and the imperative of maintaining community harmony. Imagine yourself in a traditional village, perhaps within the powerful kingdom of Congo, or among the dynamic Igbo people, or a pastoralist group in East Africa. Life is deeply communal, centered around kinship groups, extended families, and the collective well-being of the village or clan. Laws are often unwritten, passed down through generations by elders, and enforced through social pressure, arbitration, and rituals aimed at restoring balance rather than simply punishing individuals. Marriage, in most of these societies, was not just a union between two individuals, but a crucial alliance between families, often involving complex negotiations, bride wealth, and reciprocal obligations. When it came to female infidelity, the responses across sub-Saharan African traditions were incredibly varied, reflecting the immense diversity of the continent's cultures. While many societies viewed adultery as a serious offense, particularly because it could disrupt lineage, create disputes over paternity, and dishonor the husband's family. The emphasis was often on reconciliation and compensation rather than capital punishment or permanent ostracization. Unlike some of the severe, life-ending penalties we've seen, the aim here was frequently to mend the social fabric. You might witness a communal meeting, a dispute resolution process led by elders. For an adulterous wife, the consequences could include public shaming within the community, often involving a public confession or symbolic acts of atonement. She might be required to pay a fine to her husband's family, or her own family might be responsible for providing compensation in the form of livestock or goods. Divorce was certainly an option for the wronged husband, but given that marriage was a union of families, it was not always a simple or immediate process. The goal was often to restore harmony. It's like a very serious family mediation session, but with the added pressure of your entire village watching and judging. For the male lover, the penalties were often more severe and consistently involved. Compensation: he would typically be required to pay a substantial fine to the wronged husband or his family. Often in the form of valuable livestock, cattle were a common currency and symbol of wealth. In some societies, if the compensation was refused or couldn't be paid, the wronged husband might have the right to inflict physical harm on the lover, or even kill him, though such actions often risked escalating into a blood feud if not carefully managed and sanctioned by the community. In certain patriarchal societies, the lover might even be forced to compensate the husband with a female relative to serve as a wife or slave, a grim reminder of the property aspect often attached to women. Academic discussions frequently highlight the nuanced nature of gender roles and legal responses. While men in many African societies often practiced polygyny, having multiple wives, strict fidelity was generally expected of women within their unions. However, men could also face penalties for certain sexual misconducts, such as rape or seducing unmarried virgins, although these were typically fines or compensation, not death. The systems were designed to manage disputes, prevent escalating violence, and preserve the communal integrity. So, as you leave the vibrant, diverse traditions of sub-Saharan Africa, the profound emphasis on communal harmony, negotiated justice, and ritualistic reconciliation, even in the face of profound personal transgression, leaves a lasting impression. From the diverse, community-focused traditions of sub-Saharan Africa, where reconciliation often tempered justice, you are now transported across the arid expanses of the Middle East, landing squarely within the vast and enduring Ottoman Empire, a powerful Islamic caliphate that dominated large parts of Southeast Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East from the late 13th to the early 20th centuries. The air here is fragrant with strong coffee, exotic spices, and the rhythmic chant of merchants in bustling bazaars. This isn't a realm of purely unwritten customs or localized feudal laws. It's a sophisticated, multi-ethnic empire governed by a blend of Islamic Sharia law and secular imperial decrees known as Qanun, administered through a centralized bureaucracy. Imagine yourself in the vibrant heart of Istanbul, formerly Constantinople, the majestic capital of the Ottoman Empire. You're wandering through the Grand Bazaar, a labyrinth of shops, or perhaps standing outside the formidable Topkapi Palace, marveling at its intricate architecture. Life in the Ottoman Empire was structured by religious affiliation, social hierarchy, and the pervasive authority of the Sultan, who was both a temporal ruler and the spiritual leader, Caliph of Sunni Islam. The legal system, while rooted in Sharia, often incorporated local customs and pragmatic imperial legislation, creating a complex, sometimes flexible, approach to justice. when it came to female infidelity, still termed zina under Islamic law. The Ottoman legal system largely adhered to the principles of Sharia, as we briefly explored in the Islamic Golden Age. This meant that, in theory, the hudded penalties, including stoning for married individuals, were prescribed. However, as before, the evidentiary requirements were extraordinarily stringent for adult, sane, male Muslim witnesses who directly observed the act of penetration. This incredibly high bar made actual convictions leading to stoning exceedingly rare. It's like demanding a perfectly choreographed dance routine from 4 complete strangers, on command, in a very specific lighting. Almost impossible. Consequently, what you would more commonly observe in Ottoman society were cases handled not through hudded punishments, but through discretionary punishments, tazir, administered by local judges, qadis. These punishments were designed to be flexible, aiming at public deterrence and societal order rather than strict divine retribution. For an adulterous woman, tazir could involve public flogging fewer lashes than the hudded maximum of 100, and usually less severe, imprisonment or public shaming. She might be paraded through the streets, or have her hair cut, or be banished from her community. While not fatal, these punishments inflicted profound social stigma and often led to divorce and destitution. It was a potent combination of physical discomfort and social ruin, far less dramatic than stoning, but still deeply scarring. For the male lover, similar tazir punishments applied. Both parties would face the wrath of the husband, who also had the right to divorce his wife and reclaim any dowry or gifts given during the marriage. While the husband could technically appeal to the qadi for more severe punishment for the lover, the strict evidence rules still applied. However, a husband might also resort to extra-legal measures to restore his honor, especially if he was a powerful figure, though the state generally preferred disputes to be handled through official channels. To maintain order, academic discussions often highlight the pragmatism of the Ottoman legal system. Despite the theoretical severity of Sharia for zina, the practical application emphasized societal stability and the prevention of disorder. Records from qadi courts revealed that cases of illicit sexual relations were indeed brought, but they often resulted in lesser tazir penalties due to insufficient evidence for hud. Moreover, the Ottoman emphasis on the rights of non-Muslim communities, militants, meant that different religious groups within the empire often had their own internal legal systems that might handle infidelity according to their own religious laws, adding another layer of complexity. So, as you leave the intricate world of Ottoman justice, the fascinating interplay of strict religious law, pragmatic imperial administration, and diverse community customs paints a nuanced picture of consequences for female infidelity. From the complex, multi-layered legal system of the Ottoman Empire, where Sharia was tempered by imperial pragmatism, you are now transported westward across the Mediterranean Sea to the vibrant, intellectually charged, and often turbulent world of Renaissance Italy, roughly spanning from the 14th to the 16th centuries. The air here is alive with the scent of olive groves, fresh paint, and the ambitious spirit of humanism. This isn't a single, unified state, but a patchwork of fiercely independent city-states: Florence, Venice, Rome, Milan, a crucible of art, commerce, and intense political rivalry, where honor, reputation, and the control of women were absolutely paramount. Imagine yourself in the bustling streets of Florence, the jewel of the Renaissance, where grand cathedrals pierce the sky and powerful merchant families, like the Medici, wield immense influence. Life here is characterized by a fervent rediscovery of classical learning, dazzling artistic innovation, and a rigid social hierarchy where family name and public perception are everything. For aristocratic and wealthy merchant families, the preservation of honor, the purity of lineage, and the sanctity of alliances formed through marriage were non-negotiable. An affront to any of these could unravel decades of careful social climbing and economic maneuvering. When a woman, particularly one from a prominent family, was accused of infidelity in Renaissance Italy, the consequences were devastatingly focused on public shame and the absolute ruin of her reputation, honor. While secular laws existed and church courts continued to play a role, the most potent form of punishment was often administered not by formal decree, but by the relentless, all-consuming gaze of society itself. Adultery was seen as a profound betrayal that tainted not just the individual woman, but her entire family. You might hear hushed, scandalized whispers spreading through the piazzas like wildfire. For an adulterous wife, the most common outcome was forced confinement. She might be sent to a convent, not for spiritual penance as much as for social sequestration, a permanent removal from society, effectively a living burial. Alternatively, she could be confined within her family home, placed under strict surveillance, and stripped of all social interaction. Her reputation would be utterly destroyed, rendering her unmarriable and uninvited to any respectable social gathering. It's like being permanently blacklisted from every social club, gala, and even the local gelato shop. For the rest of your natural life, for the male lover, the consequences varied. He might face fines, banishment from the city, or, if caught by the wronged husband, the very real threat of physical violence or even assassination, which, while technically illegal, was often tolerated as a means of restoring honor in a society where personal reputation was so vital. Duels, though often prohibited, were also a way for injured parties to seek satisfaction. In some extreme cases, particularly for lower-class women, more physical and public punishments were not unheard of. Accounts exist of women being publicly flogged, having their hair shaved, or being paraded through the streets, though these were more prevalent in earlier medieval periods and less common among the elite in the High Renaissance. The emphasis shifted more towards social and economic ruin for the upper classes, given the greater value placed on their public image. Academic discussions frequently highlight the pervasive culture of honor and shame in Renaissance Italy. While formal laws might have prescribed certain penalties, the true power lay in social stigma and the informal enforcement of family honor. Fathers and brothers often held the right to act as vigilantes, even in cases of suspected infidelity, if they felt the family name was sufficiently sullied. This informal justice often operated outside, or even above, the state's official legal system. So, as you leave the artistic brilliance and intense social pressures of Renaissance Italy, the profound weight of public perception and the devastating power of familial honor leave a lasting, chilling impression. Your private life in this era was very much a public spectacle. From the vibrant, honor-driven city-states of Renaissance Italy, where social shame could be a woman's harshest sentence, you are now transported across the vast Atlantic Ocean to the nascent settlements of colonial America, specifically focusing on the stern, often Puritan-dominated colonies of the 17th and 18th centuries. The air here is crisp, filled with the scent of pine forests, freshly tilled earth, and an unwavering commitment to religious piety. This isn't a realm of European monarchies or ancient empires. It's a collection of self-governing communities, often founded on deeply held religious principles, where moral transgressions were seen not just as legal infractions, but as sins against God and threats to the very spiritual purity of the nascent society. Imagine yourself in a small New England village, perhaps Plymouth or Boston. It's simple. Wooden houses clustered around a meeting house that serves as both church and civic center. Life is hard, dictated by the relentless demands of farming, the constant threat of the wilderness, and the pervasive, often suffocating authority of the Puritan church elders. Every aspect of life, from dress to demeanor, was scrutinized, and morality was not a private matter. It was a communal responsibility, vigorously enforced to maintain God's favor and the collective salvation of the community. When a woman was accused of infidelity, often referred to simply as adultery, or fornication depending on marital status. In colonial America, the consequences were explicitly public, designed to shame, deter, and cleanse the community of sin. Unlike the private family honor systems of some societies, here, the state, heavily influenced by religious doctrine, took an active role in punishing moral offenses. The goal was to ensure public repentance and conformity, safeguarding the godly society from divine wrath. You might witness a grim scene in the town square. For an adulterous woman, the most common punishment was public humiliation. She might be forced to stand in a public place, like the pillory or the stocks, exposed to the gaze, jeers, and occasional hurled refuse of the community. Even more enduringly, she might be ordered to wear a visible letter, often a scarlet A for adultery, sewn onto her outer garments for a specified period, sometimes for life. This mark served as a permanent badge of shame, making her easily identifiable and socially ostracized. It's like being given a lifelong, mandatory, very uncomfortable uniform that broadcasts your deepest transgression to everyone you meet. Talk about a fashion statement you'd rather avoid. Beyond public shaming, physical punishments were also common, including public whipping. While death penalties for adultery were theoretically prescribed in some early colonial laws, borrowing from biblical Old Testament mandates, these were exceedingly rare in practice, typically reserved for repeat offenders or particularly egregious circumstances. Imprisonment was also an option, but the colonists preferred public shaming as it required fewer resources and provided a more visible lesson to the community. For the male lover, the punishments were often similar, though sometimes slightly less severe, depending on the specific colonial laws. He might also face public shaming, fines, or whipping. However, the social stigma for a man, while present, was generally not as utterly ruinous as it was for a woman. A man, especially if he was a pillar of the community, might weather the storm more easily, whereas a woman's reputation, once sullied, was almost impossible to redeem. This pervasive gender double standard, rooted in patriarchal societal structures and religious interpretations, continued to manifest even in the New World. Academic discussions often explore the motivations behind such harsh public punishments. Were they truly about spiritual purity, or also about social control in fragile, nascent communities? The scarcity of resources meant that imprisonment was costly, making public shaming a highly efficient and visible deterrent. The goal was clearly to maintain strict social order and a perceived moral rectitude, believing that God's blessing depended on it. So, as you leave the stern, God-fearing communities of colonial America, the stark reality of public shaming and the profound weight of religious judgment leave an indelible mark on your thoughts. Leaving the stern, God-fearing communities of colonial America, where a scarlet letter was a constant companion, you are now transported, with a subtle temporal shift, to a slightly later, yet equally fascinating, period in the American colonies, the chilling era of the Salem witch trials, specifically the infamous events of 1692 to 1693 in colonial Massachusetts. The air here feels heavy with suspicion, fear, and the pervasive anxiety of a community under intense stress. This isn't just a direct continuation of legal responses to infidelity. It's an exploration of how accusations of sexual misconduct, including adultery, became dangerously intertwined with supernatural accusations, creating a truly terrifying nexus of legal and social peril for women. Imagine yourself in the winter-nipped village of Salem, Massachusetts. The wooden houses huddle against the cold, and inside, whispers spread like wildfire. Whispers of spectral torments, bewitchment, and pacts with the devil. While the primary focus of the trials was, ostensibly, witchcraft, you'll quickly discover that many of the initial accusations and underlying suspicions often had roots in perceived deviations from strict Puritan moral codes, including alleged sexual misconduct or a general disregard for accepted norms of female behavior. When a woman in Salem was accused of witchcraft, the underlying factors were rarely simple. Often, those accused were women who were somehow different, perhaps outspoken, economically independent, elderly and without male protectors, or, crucially for our narrative, perceived to be morally transgressive in their personal lives. While adultery itself wasn't directly tried as witchcraft, accusations of illicit sexual behavior, whether real or imagined, frequently served to predispose the community and the accusers to believe the worst about a woman. It was a compounding factor, making her more vulnerable to the ultimate charge. It's almost like a hidden debuff in a very grim role-playing game, making you far more susceptible to the instant kill spell. You might hear testimony in the crowded, tense courtroom. Witness statements against accused witches often included vague references to unchristian behavior, quarrels, disputes over property, or even suspicions of infanticide. But subtly woven into these narratives, or perhaps openly discussed as part of a woman's bad character, were whispers of premarital sexual activity, pregnancies out of wedlock, or, indeed, marital infidelity. Such accusations, even if unproven, in a formal legal sense, could severely damage a woman's standing and make her a prime target for a witchcraft accusation. It's a chilling reminder that in a society obsessed with moral purity, a woman's perceived sexual deviance could easily be twisted into evidence of demonic influence. Consider the case of Bridget Bishop, one of the first individuals executed. During the trials, while the official charges were witchcraft, she was known to have a scandalous reputation, having been accused of fornication in the past and having a contentious relationship with her husband. Her perceived moral failings likely contributed to the community's willingness to believe she had made a pact with the devil. The logic, however twisted, was that if a woman strayed from God's path in one way, sexual sin, she was more likely to stray in another, more severe way, witchcraft. Academic discussions frequently highlight the social anxieties and gendered nature of the Salem witch trials. While Puritan society theoretically held both men and women to high moral standards, the societal pressure for female chastity and domestic conformity was immense. Women who challenged these norms, or whose personal lives were deemed suspicious, were disproportionately targeted. This connection between perceived sexual immorality and witchcraft accusations demonstrates how deeply ingrained societal expectations regarding female behavior could lead to catastrophic outcomes far beyond simple legal penalties for adultery. So, as you leave the chilling, fear-laden atmosphere of Salem, the profound interconnection between sexual transgression and the terrifying specter of supernatural accusation leaves a truly unsettling impression. From the chilling intersections of moral deviance and witchcraft accusations in colonial America, you are now transported forward in time and across the expanding continents, arriving in the heart of the Industrial Revolution, a transformative era roughly spanning the late 18th to the mid-19th centuries. The air here is no longer filled with the scent of pine forests, but with the thick, sooty aroma of coal smoke, the clatter of machinery, and the relentless hum of burgeoning factories. This isn't just a period of technological innovation. It's a time of profound societal upheaval, including massive population shifts from rural areas to overcrowded industrial cities, leading to new social anxieties and, consequently, new approaches to the age-old problem of marital breakdown and infidelity. Imagine yourself in a rapidly growing factory town in England, perhaps Manchester or Birmingham. Rows of grim, utilitarian brick houses stretch endlessly, and the streets are crowded with a new class of industrial workers. Life is characterized by long hours, harsh working conditions, and the pressures of urban anonymity. While traditional moral codes remain strong, particularly among the middle and upper classes, the sheer scale of social change, coupled with nascent ideas about individual rights and privacy, began to subtly alter how society and the law approached the breakdown of marriage in this era. Marriage was still primarily understood as a lifelong, sacred union, often with significant property implications. Divorce, particularly in England, remained incredibly difficult to obtain, requiring a costly and complex private act of Parliament. This meant that for most people, legally ending a marriage was simply out of reach. Consequently, infidelity, while still a grave social sin, often led to informal separations or social ostracization rather than formal, legal dissolution. When a woman was accused of infidelity during the Industrial Revolution, her fate, particularly if she was from the burgeoning middle class, was often one of profound social ruin and economic destitution. Unlike previous eras where public physical punishment might be common, the emphasis now shifted more towards a woman's complete loss of reputation and social standing. A husband could still initiate the aforementioned criminal conversation, lost her against his wife's lover, seeking monetary damages. This type of legal action, however, continued to focus on the male lover as the offender and the wife as the damaged property, with the woman herself having no direct legal voice. It's like watching two people argue over a broken vase, where you are the vase, and nobody asks your opinion on how it got shattered. The profound social consequences for the woman meant she would almost certainly be ostracized by respectable society, shunned by family and friends, and potentially left without any means of financial support, with limited employment opportunities deemed respectable for women. She could easily fall into poverty or be forced into desperate circumstances. If she had children, she would likely lose all access to them, as custody almost invariably went to the father. The era's rigid gender roles meant that a man's infidelity, while frowned upon, rarely carried the same catastrophic social or economic consequences for him. He could often continue his public life with far less damage to his reputation. Academic discussions frequently highlight how the Industrial Revolution, despite its rapid advancements, paradoxically reinforced many traditional gender inequalities. The rise of the middle-class cult of domesticity placed immense pressure on women to be moral guardians of the home, making any deviation from this ideal particularly devastating. While divorce laws slowly began to change later in the 19th century, making it slightly more accessible, for much of the Industrial Revolution, the woman caught in infidelity faced a profound, quiet social death, trapped by an unforgiving society and a legal system that offered her little recourse. So, as you move through the smoky, bustling cities of the Industrial Revolution, the pervasive weight of societal expectation and the silent, grinding mechanisms of social condemnation leave a lasting, rather melancholic impression. From the sooty, anxiety-laden streets of the Industrial Revolution, where social ruin was a quiet but brutal sentence, you are now transported into the more rigid and morally prescriptive era of the Victorian era, specifically the period spanning roughly from 1837 to 1901, primarily in Great Britain and its vast empire. The air here feels heavy with a sense of strict propriety, rigid class distinctions, and an almost obsessive concern with public appearances. This isn't just a time of technological advancement. It's an age defined by a fierce commitment to moral rectitude, particularly regarding gender roles and sexual behavior, making infidelity a truly catastrophic social event for women. Imagine yourself in a grand Victorian drawing room, perhaps in London, filled with heavy velvet curtains, ornate furniture, and the hushed whispers of polite society. Life is governed by an elaborate code of etiquette, a profound emphasis on domesticity for women, and an almost religious adherence to appearances. The middle and upper classes, especially, lived under a constant, scrutinizing gaze, where any perceived transgression could lead to instant and irreversible social downfall. For women, their moral purity and unblemished reputation were considered their most valuable assets, inextricably linked to their family's honor and their very prospects. In life, when a woman was accused of infidelity during the Victorian era, the impact was nothing short of social ruin. Unlike earlier periods with more direct physical punishments, the Victorian response was a meticulous, devastating process of ostracization that often left a woman utterly destitute and isolated. Adultery was seen as the ultimate betrayal, not just of her husband, but of the sacred institution of marriage and the very moral fabric of society. You might hear the devastating whispers in polite society, the slow, agonizing spread of scandal. If a wife committed adultery, her husband had immediate grounds for divorce. However, even with the passage of the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857, which made divorce accessible through civil courts rather than just Parliament, it remained a heavily gender-imbalanced system. A man could divorce his wife simply for adultery. A woman, however, had to prove not just adultery, but also an additional aggravating factor, such as cruelty, desertion, or incest. This inherent legal disparity reflected the era's double standard. A man's sexual indiscretions, while not ideal, rarely carried the same societal condemnation or legal consequences as a woman's. For the unfaithful wife, divorce meant an almost total loss. She would lose all rights to her children, who were almost invariably awarded to the father. She would lose her social standing, becoming an outcast, often referred to as a fallen woman. Her family might disown her to protect their own reputation, leaving her without financial support or a home. With extremely limited employment opportunities considered respectable for women, she often faced a stark choice: extreme poverty, reliance on charity, or, tragically, prostitution as the only means of survival. It was a complete annihilation of her former life, far more insidious than a single, quick punishment. It's like being erased from the social registry. Every photograph of you delicately snipped out of family albums, and your very existence relegated to a polite but absolute silence. The infamous criminal conversation lawsuit, Crim Khan, where the husband sued the male lover for damages, continued to be a feature of Victorian legal life. These cases, often sensationalized by the burgeoning popular press, dragged the intimate details of marital breakdown into the full glare of public scrutiny, further cementing the woman's downfall, even though she wasn't technically the defendant. Academic discussions continue to explore the hypocrisy inherent in Victorian morality, where outward piety often masked private transgressions, particularly among men. The rigid gender roles and the cult of domesticity placed an impossible burden of moral perfection on women, making any slip a catastrophic fall, while social reforms slowly chipped away at some of these legal and social inequalities in later decades. For the bulk of the Victorian era, female infidelity was a guaranteed path to complete and utter social ruin, a fate worse than many physical punishments. As you close your eyes on the tightly laced corsets and stern social codes of the Victorian age, the suffocating weight of reputation and the quiet devastation of social banishment leave a chilling, almost palpable impression. From the suffocating propriety and social destruction of the Victorian era, where a woman's reputation was her fragile world, you now move into the early decades of the 20th century, roughly from the dawn of the new millennium in 1900, through to the Roaring Twenties and the Great Depression. The air here feels charged with a nascent sense of liberation. The hum of burgeoning technology like automobiles and radios, and the profound, if often unsettling, tremors of social change. This isn't just a time of shifting fashion and new inventions. It's an era where traditional gender roles, sexual morality, and the legal framework surrounding marriage began a slow, often contentious, dance of evolution, fundamentally altering the landscape for women accused of infidelity. Imagine yourself in a bustling city like New York or London, where women are increasingly entering the workforce, defying traditional expectations, and even gaining the right to vote in many places. The rigid social structures of the Victorian age are slowly, painfully, giving way to new ideas about individual freedom, expression, and autonomy. While infidelity remained a significant social taboo and a valid ground for divorce, the absolute, irreversible social annihilation that characterized the Victorian period began to soften, albeit unevenly. When a woman was accused of infidelity in the early 20th century, the consequences were still severe, but the mechanisms of punishment started to shift from outright social ostracization to more complex legal and personal battles. The criminal conversation lawsuit, where a husband sued the male lover, while still existing in some jurisdictions, began to fade from prominence, increasingly seen as archaic and undignified. The focus shifted more directly to divorce proceedings. You might observe a tense divorce court. While the double standard persisted, men could often divorce for simple adultery, while women might still need to prove additional cruelty or abandonment. The legal playing field slowly began to level. More importantly, the social stigma, while still very real, became less universally damning. A divorced woman, even one whose infidelity was publicly known, might still face judgment. But the possibility of rebuilding a life, finding new employment, or even remarrying began to emerge. It was no longer an absolute, inescapable social death sentence, but perhaps more akin to a very public, very painful demotion, with a chance, however slim, for future promotion. It's like losing your main social media account, but realizing there are other platforms, or even, gasp, real-life connections, where you might find acceptance. The changing economic landscape played a crucial role. As more women gained access to education and employment outside the home, their economic dependence on a husband or family lessened. This newfound, albeit limited, financial independence provided a crucial buffer against the catastrophic poverty that often accompanied divorce for a Victorian woman. A woman could, theoretically, support herself, even if her social standing suffered. Academic discussions frequently highlight the sexual revolution of the Roaring Twenties, often characterized by flappers, jazz, and a perceived loosening of moral strictures. While this was largely a phenomenon of urban youth and the elite, it reflected a broader societal unease with rigid Victorian morality. The two world wars, with their massive disruption of traditional roles, also profoundly impacted gender dynamics, accelerating the revaluation of women's place in society and, by extension, the severity of punishments for sexual transgressions. So, as you move through the crackle of early radio broadcasts and the rumble of new urban development in the early 20th century, the slow, often hesitant, shifts in social attitudes and legal frameworks offer a glimmer of evolving, though still imperfect, justice for women accused of infidelity. From the cautious social shifts of the early 20th century, where the seeds of change were slowly beginning to sprout, you are now transported into a period of profound ideological and social transformation, the era of the Soviet Union. Specifically, from its formation in 1922 through its mid-century development, the air here is charged with revolutionary fervor, the scent of industrial ambition, and the pervasive ideology of a state that sought to fundamentally reshape not just political and economic life, but also personal morality and family structures. This isn't a realm of traditional Western values or private religious piety. It's a society where individual behavior, including infidelity, was often viewed through a very specific communist lens, impacting women in unique ways. Imagine yourself in a bustling Soviet city like Moscow or Leningrad. Perhaps during the 1930s or 1950s, life is characterized by collectivization, industrial quotas, and a relentless emphasis on the collective good over individual desires. The state actively sought to dismantle what it viewed as bourgeois moral codes, including traditional notions of marriage and family, initially promoting ideas of free love and easy divorce in the immediate aftermath of the 1917 revolution. However, this early permissiveness soon gave way to a more pragmatic and often surprisingly conservative stance, particularly under Stalin, as the state recognized the need for stable families to raise future socialist citizens. When a woman was accused of infidelity in the Soviet Union, the consequences were less about formal legal penalties in the Western sense, and more about social condemnation, party discipline, and economic repercussions. Adultery was not typically a criminal offense punishable by imprisonment or death, as it had been in some earlier societies. Instead, it was viewed as an act that undermined the stability of the family, potentially impacting labor, productivity, and reflecting a lack of ideological commitment. It was a deviation from the ideal of the socialist citizen. You might hear whispers in a communal apartment or during a party meeting. While easy divorce was indeed available throughout much of Soviet history, though it became more difficult again under Stalin, a woman whose infidelity led to a family breakdown could face severe judgment from her work collective or party cell. These were powerful informal courts, capable of issuing reprimands, public denunciations, or even leading to demotion or dismissal from a job. Losing a job, especially a good one, in a state-controlled economy, could be devastating for a woman, limiting her access to housing, food rations, and social benefits. It's like being subjected to a mandatory, very public performance review by your entire office, with your career hanging in the balance. And everyone knows all your personal business, the state, in its pursuit of a new socialist morality, often treated women as equal partners in the workforce and society. Yet patriarchal attitudes often persisted, subtly influencing responses to infidelity, while men could also face censure for extramarital affairs. The burden of maintaining family stability and moral purity often fell disproportionately on women. The focus was on societal order and adherence to the state's moral guidelines, which evolved over time. Early revolutionary ideals of sexual liberation gave way to a more rigid promotion of monogamous, stable family units as fundamental to building communism. Academic discussions often explore the paradoxes of Soviet gender policy, promoting formal equality in public life while traditional expectations often lingered in private spheres. The state's intervention into personal morality was profound, but its methods differed significantly from those of capitalist societies. Instead of scarlet letters or crim con lawsuits, the punishment was often administered through the omnipresent mechanisms of the party and the workplace. So, as you leave the grand ideological avenues of the Soviet Union, the unique ways in which state ideology shaped responses to female infidelity, emphasizing social control through collective pressure rather than direct legal retribution, leaves a thought-provoking impression. From the ideologically driven landscape of the Soviet Union, where social and party pressure were potent tools of control, you are now transported to the tumultuous, yet profoundly liberating, aftermath of post-World War II societies, roughly. From the mid-1940s through the 1960s, the air here is charged with the scent of rebuilding, optimism for a new future, and the undeniable reverberations of seismic societal shifts. This isn't just an era of peace or Cold War tension. It's a time when traditional gender roles, family structures, and sexual morality underwent unprecedented scrutiny and transformation, fundamentally reshaping the experience of women and altering responses to infidelity. Imagine yourself in a bustling American suburb or a European city slowly recovering from the scars of war. Men are returning home. Women are often leaving factory jobs to embrace a renewed emphasis on domesticity. Yet the wartime experience has irrevocably changed perceptions of women's capabilities and independence. The economic boom in many Western countries allows for greater prosperity, but also for new anxieties about social conformity and the breakdown of traditional values. When a woman was accused of infidelity in this post-war era, the consequences, while still significant, were increasingly defined by changing social expectations, the evolving legal landscape of divorce, and the burgeoning psychological understanding of relationships. It was no longer universally a public crime leading to legal or physical mutilation, nor even always a guarantee of complete social annihilation. The rigid Victorian moral code was slowly, often painfully, eroding, replaced by more complex, and sometimes contradictory, societal norms. You might observe the quiet drama of a divorce proceeding, perhaps less sensationalized than in earlier eras. While infidelity remained the most common grounds for divorce, legal reforms slowly began to create a more equitable system. particularly as no-fault divorce laws started to emerge in later decades, removing the need to prove fault for a marital dissolution. This meant that while adultery might still be the reason for a divorce, the legal focus shifted away from punishing the guilty party and towards simply dissolving the marriage. This was a massive shift, moving away from blame and towards practical solutions for ending a union. It's like switching from a courtroom drama to a somewhat dreary administrative process. Less dramatic, but often more humane. However, the social stigma, while softened, was far from gone. A divorced woman, particularly if her infidelity was known, might still face judgment from family, friends, and community, and her social life could be significantly impacted. Yet, the booming economy and the increasing availability of employment outside traditional domestic roles offered women more avenues for independence. She might find it easier to support herself and her children, and the idea of a single mother, while still facing challenges, became less of an absolute social anomaly. The post-war era also saw the rise of psychology and counseling, subtly influencing how infidelity was viewed. It began to be understood less as purely amoral failing and more as a symptom of underlying marital problems or individual psychological issues. This didn't excuse the behavior, but it offered a new framework for understanding and sometimes for private resolution rather than public shaming. Academic discussions frequently highlight the baby boom and the return to domesticity in the 1950s as a complex period for women, balancing new freedoms with renewed social pressure to conform to traditional roles. Yet, the seeds of the sexual revolution of the 1960s were firmly planted in this era, as unspoken social conventions were increasingly challenged. The experience of women during the war, their economic contributions, and their increasing awareness of their own capabilities created an irreversible shift. So, as you fade out from the suburban landscapes and evolving social dynamics of the post-World War II era, the subtle yet profound weakening of traditional strictures and the slow emergence of new individual autonomies leave a hopeful, albeit still complicated, impression. From the complex social dynamics of the post-World War II era, where societal expectations slowly began to yield to personal autonomy, you are now transported to the rapidly accelerating, interconnected world of the modern-day legalities, essentially. From the late 20th century to the present, the air here is buzzing with digital communication, the relentless flow of information, and the constant rapid evolution of social norms. This isn't a realm of monolithic legal codes or universally applied moral judgments. It's a global tapestry of diverse legal systems, where the concept of infidelity has largely moved from the realm of criminal offense to a deeply personal, civil matter. Imagine yourself in a contemporary courtroom in, say, California, or even in a progressive European capital. The legal language is precise, focused on individual rights and responsibilities. The fundamental shift is this: in most developed countries today, adultery is no longer considered a crime. The idea of the state punishing individuals for sexual infidelity with imprisonment, public shaming, or physical mutilation is overwhelmingly a relic of the past. This represents a monumental departure from centuries of legal tradition across virtually every civilization we've explored. It's like switching from a very strict, old-school board game where every move is judged, to a free-form role-playing game where the rules are largely up to the players, or rather, the individuals involved. When a woman or a man is involved in infidelity today, the primary legal consequence lies within the framework of divorce proceedings. Most modern legal systems have moved towards no-fault divorce, meaning that a spouse can obtain a divorce without having to prove the other party committed a specific wrongdoing like adultery. This dramatically reduces the legal necessity of proving infidelity in court, as the marriage can be dissolved simply due to irreconcilable differences or irretrievable breakdown. This is a huge relief for many, as it allows for privacy and avoids the public airing of very personal grievances that characterized earlier eras. However, while no longer a crime, infidelity can still have legal implications in some jurisdictions, particularly concerning the division of marital assets or alimony spousal support. In some U.S. states, for example, a judge might consider marital misconduct, including adultery, when determining the amount or duration of alimony, or if there's been a dissipation of marital assets due to an affair. Similarly, in some countries, while not a crime, adultery might still affect aspects of a divorce settlement. Yet, this is generally about financial adjustments, not about personal liberty or physical punishment. The social consequences of infidelity, while no longer state-imposed, remain significant. They are now largely mediated through personal relationships, family dynamics, and social circles. A woman who commits adultery may still face judgment from her family, friends, or community, and her reputation could certainly be damaged. However, the omnipresence of social media and the rapid dissemination of information mean that private infidelities can still become very public very quickly, leading to what some might call online shaming or cancellation, a modern form of public condemnation that echoes historical practices, albeit without legal enforcement. It's like the court of public opinion has gone global and is always in session. And the jury is everyone with an internet connection. Academic discussions often highlight the ongoing evolution of sexual morality and gender equality. While legal equality in marriage and divorce has largely been achieved in many parts of the world, societal expectations and double standards can still persist. The rise of individual autonomy and privacy rights has fundamentally reshaped how infidelity is dealt with, pushing it from the public square into the private domain of personal relationships and civil law. So, as you observe the intricate legal frameworks of the modern day, the dramatic shift from punitive state intervention to a more nuanced, civil approach to infidelity marks a profound chapter in human legal history. From the nuanced, predominantly civil legalities of the modern day, where state punishment for infidelity has largely receded, you are now transported to a thoughtful contemplation of lasting societal echoes, considering how these ancient attitudes and historical experiences, particularly regarding women and infidelity, continue to subtly linger, shape, and even surface in contemporary perceptions and societal norms. The air here is quieter, more reflective, carrying the soft resonance of history's long arc. This isn't about specific laws or punishments, but about the enduring cultural footprint left by millennia of patriarchal structures and moral codes. Imagine yourself quietly observing the subtle ways history weaves itself into the present, while the scarlet letter has long been retired from public wear, and the river ordeal exists only in historical texts. The ghost of those strictures can still be felt. For centuries, across myriad civilizations, a woman's fidelity was inextricably linked to her family's honor, her social standing, and the legitimacy of her children. This deep-seated historical association created a profound, almost innate, societal expectation that continues to influence how infidelity is perceived. Even in an era of supposed gender equality, you might notice, for instance, how headlines or social media narratives about celebrity divorces still often treat female infidelity with a harsher, more condemnatory tone than male infidelity. A woman involved in an affair might still be labeled with terms like homewrecker or adulteress, loaded words carrying centuries of moral judgment, while a man involved in a similar transgression might be viewed with more leniency or even as simply human. This isn't a legal decree, but a societal echo, a subtle bias ingrained from eras where a man's infidelity was a peccadillo and a woman's was a societal catastrophe. It's like an old, faded photograph that still colors your perception, even when you know it's no longer the sharp reality. Think about the persistent pressure on women, often unspoken, to maintain a flawless public image, particularly in relationships. The historical emphasis on female pudicizia in Rome or haji in Japan might seem antiquated, but its shadow can still be felt in the disproportionate scrutiny placed on women's appearance, behavior, and perceived moral integrity. A woman's social value, even unconsciously, can still feel more intrinsically tied to her perceived fidelity than a man's. Academic discussions frequently delve into the enduring gendered double standard of infidelity. Despite legal reforms and shifts towards equality, studies in sociology and psychology often reveal that women who commit infidelity tend to face more severe social consequences, including greater blame, stronger moral condemnation, and more significant damage to their long-term reputation compared to their male counterparts. This suggests that while formal legal punishments have largely disappeared, the informal, social penalties, rooted in ancient patriarchal norms, continue to persist. It's almost as if the societal blueprint, drawn up millennia ago, still subtly guides our collective judgments, even as we attempt to build a more equitable structure on top of it. Moreover, the historical vulnerability of women, their economic dependence, and their lack of legal recourse in past societies, has left a legacy of power imbalances in relationships that can still manifest today. While laws have changed, the subtle psychological and cultural pressures stemming from centuries of subjugation and control can still impact individual experiences of infidelity and its aftermath. The fear of social ostracism, financial hardship, or loss of children, while mitigated by modern laws, still resonates from a collective memory where those fears were very real. Daily possibilities for women who strayed. So, as you reflect on the long and often harsh journey of women through the history of infidelity, you realize that while overt punishments have faded, the powerful societal echoes of those ancient strictures still whisper through the corridors of our modern world, subtly influencing perceptions, judgments, and the complex landscape of human relationships. Sweet dreams.